The year is 1834. Madrid is still caught in the whirlpool of tension that has followed the sudden death of King Ferdinand II. The great royal palace is eerily silent, its stone walls reverberating with an unsettling stillness that fills the grand halls and royal chambers. As the royal physician, you've spent your career dealing with the highest echelons of society, those whose bloodlines have been tainted by centuries of royal inbreeding. You are accustomed to the weight of history that surrounds you, but nothing in your training has prepared you for the summons you have just received. The message arrives in an official envelope, sealed in the dark wax of the Spanish monarchy. It is a summons that makes your heart race in ways you never expected. You have been called to the royal palace at once, and no explanation has been provided. A simple phrase stands out from the rest. The task is urgent. The implication hangs heavy in the air. Even though you are accustomed to the intrigues and mysteries that have surrounded the Spanish crown for years, a sense of foreboding settles in your chest as you prepare to leave your quarters and journey to the royal palace. As you walk through the marble corridors of the palace, you notice the tension that seems to grip the very walls. Whispers float from every corner. The common people are not the only ones shocked by the king's sudden death. This is a royal family that has seen its share of tragedies. But this one feels different. The very air feels thick with secrecy, as if the walls themselves are holding their breath, waiting to reveal something unknown. There are rumors swirling in the hallways, whispers about the king's body and the strange task that awaits you. You try to dismiss the thoughts, but the unease in your gut only grows stronger with each step. You arrive at the Queen Regent, Maria Christina's chambers. She stands before you, her eyes red with tears, her usual composure shattered by grief. She is a woman who has been through much her life, marked by political machinations, intrigue, and the weight of ruling a nation, but today she stands as someone broken by the loss of her husband, her king. And yet it is not grief that fills the room as much as something far more unsettling, quiet desperation, a fear that you cannot place. Her voice trembles as she addresses you, yet there is a coldness in her eyes, a hardness that contrasts with the sorrow she displays. "You must come with me," she says. "There is something I need you to do for the kingdom, for Spain." You hesitate for a moment, sensing that this request will not be as simple as the words suggest. She leads you to the private chambers of the late king. As you enter, the heavy curtains are drawn, casting the room in shadows, the only light coming from a few flickering candles on the table beside the bed. And there, lying in the middle of the room, is the body of King Ferdinand II. The man who terrorized Spain for 2 decades is now cold, lifeless, and yet something about him still seems to mock you. His very presence is unsettling, as if even death cannot strip him of his power. You approach the bed slowly, your heart pounding. You have seen death many times, but there is something deeply wrong about this. Ferdinand's features, even in death, carry a look of disdain, as though he had always known he would control every moment, even this one, from beyond the grave. The sheets are pulled up to his chest, hiding what you know to be a grotesque secret, one whispered about in the shadows, but never openly discussed. It is then that you realize it is not his face that draws your attention, but what lies beneath the silk sheets. The king's body, lying motionless on the bed, holds an anatomical monstrosity that has long been the subject of whispered rumors, a grotesque legacy of his reign. For years, Ferdinand's condition was a closely guarded secret, a source of shame and twisted pride that haunted his life. And now it lies before you, both a medical curiosity and a symbol of everything that went wrong during his reign. Your hands tremble as you carefully move the silk sheets away. The sight before you is one that you will never forget: Ferdinand's enormous and deformed endowment. A grotesque deformity that defines the very man who ruled over Spain with cruelty, paranoia, and a desperation for control. As a physician, you know that this is a condition beyond the realm of medical understanding, something that defies natural explanation, and yet here it is, laid bare in front of you. As you begin to prepare the body for preservation, your mind races with the stories you've heard in hushed tones among the palace staff, the cushions that were brought in for the king's intimate moments, the desperate attempts to produce an heir, the wives who lived in constant terror. All of these stories now flood your mind. Ferdinand's body was not just that of a king, but of a man cursed by his own anatomy, a living reminder of the twisted legacy of the Habsburgs and Bourbons. Your task, however, is not just to preserve the body for future generations. It is to preserve the legacy of a man who ruled through fear, whose physical condition became the embodiment of his reign, and whose failures as a man and a monarch shaped the fate of an entire empire. You follow Queen Regent Maria Cristina through the palace halls, each step echoing in the silence, as though the very walls are holding their breath. Her footsteps are soft, yet you can sense the weight of her every movement. It is a strange thing to witness a woman so powerful, so accustomed to ruling with grace, reduced to this state, trembling, fragile, on the verge of collapse. The regal composure she had worn throughout her reign has vanished, replaced with something darker, more desperate. She leads you deeper into the private chambers of the late King Ferdinand, past ornate furniture, into the dark heart of the royal residence. The air feels heavy, thick with the scent of incense and something more metallic. The faint hint of blood that seems to linger in the room, as though the palace itself mourns. This space, normally reserved for the king's most private moments, now carries a sense of foreboding. Do you understand the gravity of what I'm asking? Maria Cristina's voice breaks the silence as she turns to face you, her expression hardening. Despite the tears that had once clouded her eyes, there is now a sharpness to her gaze, sharpness that is all too familiar to you, a reminder of the strength that once characterized her reign. She seems more like a queen of legend in this moment, a woman who must carry a heavy burden. Despite the personal devastation that she has suffered, she pauses in the doorway, giving you a moment to absorb the weight of her request. The candlelight flickers softly, casting shadows across her face. The queen seems almost to shimmer in the half-light, a spectral presence, half royal, half ghost. I know you are a man of science, she continues, her words measured but laden with unspoken terror. But even science cannot explain what you are about to encounter, what you must preserve. She lowers her gaze to the floor, then back. To you, her voice becomes almost a whisper. This is not just a royal body. This is a symbol, a thing, beyond the bounds of nature. Her words hang in the air, unsettling you in ways you hadn't anticipated. As a physician, you have spent your life studying the human body, unlocking its mysteries, repairing its flaws. But Maria Cristina is right. What you are being asked to do is beyond the realm of conventional medical knowledge. What is laid out before you, what lies beneath the king's royal sheets, is a grotesque anomaly, a physical manifestation of the twisted legacy that has ruled over Spain for centuries. Ferdinand's condition, she continues, her voice cracking with emotion, was a curse. It has been the source of suffering, not just for him, but for those who lived under his rule. It was his shame and his pride, and it led to more than just personal humiliation. It was a symbol of everything that went wrong with his reign. His obsession with power, his inability to produce an heir, the cruelty that followed him throughout his life. This monstrosity became a part of him. You listen intently, your mind racing. The Queen's words are not just an explanation of the task you face, but a glimpse into the dark heart of Ferdinand's life. His body was not just an aberration, but a manifestation of his inner turmoil, his deepest insecurities, and his worst fears. The more you think about it, the more you realize that the king's physical deformity is the very thing that governed his reign. The shadow that lurked behind every decision, every action. Maria Christina turns and walks toward the bed, her gaze fixed on the form lying under the silk sheets. You hesitate at the doorway, unsure of what to do, of what to say. The Queen stands tall, a figure of strength and sorrow. She looks at the king's body with a mixture of grief and something far darker, fear. It is as though she is staring into the abyss of history, a reminder of the immense damage that one man's existence caused. This task, she trails off, her words faltering. It is not just about preserving his body, it is about preserving the history of a nation. For if we do not preserve the evidence of what this reign did to Spain, we risk repeating it. You must understand that. You step forward, your mind still grappling with the enormity of what she is asking. It is not simply a medical procedure, but a delicate balancing act, an attempt to hold the horrors of Ferdinand's reign in place so that future generations can learn from them. But the question remains, why you? Why me? You finally ask, your voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Why have you called me to this task, Maria Christina? She meets your gaze, her expression hardening once again. You are the one who can understand it, not just as a physician, but as a man who knows what it means to be bound by something beyond your control. You have seen the consequences of power, of vanity, of desperation. You understand what happens when someone is consumed by their own need for control. The Queen's words strike a chord within you. It is truth throughout your years as a physician in the palace. You have witnessed the destructive nature of power, the way it can warp even the best of men. And now, standing before Ferdinand's body, you are confronted with the very manifestation of that corruption, a man who, for all his royal grandeur, was a victim of his own twisted inheritance. But it is not just the king who lies before you, it is a kingdom. Ferdinand's reign, a chaotic mix of political failures, cruelty, and misguided efforts to secure his lineage, has left Spain in ruins. You can feel the weight of it in the room, the despair that pervades the air. The Queen, though strong in her resolve, seems to be carrying the weight of an entire nation's failures on her shoulders. And now, it seems, it is your responsibility to preserve that history, to carry the burden of truth. Maria Christina steps aside, allowing you to approach the bed. She looks at you once more, her expression softening. You must preserve him, for Spain, for history, but be careful, do not let the truth be buried along with him. Her words linger in the air as you step forward, the king's body now within reach. You take a deep breath, preparing yourself for what you are about to face. What lies beneath the sheets is not just the end of Ferdinand's reign, it is the beginning of something else. A truth that once revealed can never be undone. You approach the bed slowly, each step measured, as if the very ground beneath you knows the significance of what is about to unfold. The room, draped in darkness, seems to close in on you, the weight of the moment pressing down on your shoulders. Ferdinand's body lies there, obscured beneath the royal silk sheets. as though the fabric alone could conceal the monstrosity that had defined his reign. The air is thick with a mixture of incense and something far more unsettling, death itself. The candlelight flickers weakly in the corner, casting long, trembling shadows along the stone walls, making the space feel alive with unseen presence. Your heart pounds in your chest, a rhythmic drumbeat that resonates in your ears as you draw closer. This isn't just a king, not merely a corpse you are about to handle. This is the man who ruled Spain with an iron fist, a king whose very existence twisted the fate of the nation. His cruelty, paranoia, and relentless obsession with legacy have left scars that no history book could ever fully capture. But you are the one tasked with facing his legacy head-on. The Queen stands in the corner, silent and still, her gaze locked onto her late husband's body. She doesn't look at you as you move closer, yet you can feel her presence behind you, a reminder of the burden she has placed upon you. Her silence is deafening, as if the weight of the task before you has rendered her mute with despair. With a deep breath, you gather your courage. You reach for the sheets, your fingers brushing against the cool fabric. The silk slips beneath, your touch like a veil between the living and the dead. You hesitate, a moment of uncertainty passing through you. What if, in this moment, you find something that not only defies medical understanding but shatters everything you thought you knew about the human form? What if the very sight of it breaks you? But you are a physician, man bound by his oath to seek understanding, to confront the unexplainable, and to preserve life, or at the very least, the legacy of it. And so, you take a deep breath and pull back the sheets. The grotesque reality of King Ferdinand II is laid bare before you. It is not just a man who has died, but a king whose legacy has become something twisted, something warped by nature and ambition alike. There, beneath the sheets, is the monstrous truth: his endowment, grotesquely oversized and bizarrely shaped. A grotesque deformity that defies all natural law. Even in death, the size and shape of his body's greatest secret are shocking. His member lies there, so outsized in proportion that it appears as though nature itself had conspired to mock Ferdinand at every turn. It is not merely the size that is shocking, but the strange curvature, the unevenness, the bizarre bulges and growths along its length, an anatomical monstrosity that no one would dare speak of openly, yet all knew about in hushed whispers. The legend of Ferdinand's condition has been passed through the corridors of the palace. A whispered story, a taboo that no one dared to touch. His sexual dysfunction, hidden away behind royal walls, was a closely guarded secret, even as it became the defining characteristic of his reign. His lust for power, his obsession with producing an heir, these were the public faces of his rule. But underneath it all lay this one dark truth, the very thing that defined him and ultimately destroyed him. The stories you had heard in the palace corridors now rush back to you. Tales of desperate wives, of custom-made cushions and specially crafted medical aids, all designed to allow the king to fulfill his royal duties without causing harm to his wives. His failure to produce an heir had become an obsession, a task that consumed him completely, driving him to seek out every remedy, every quack physician, every alchemist who promised to solve his problems. The royal court had become a strange theatre where the private struggles of a man with an impossible condition were played out in public, in the shadows of the monarchy. But now, as you stand before the king's body, it is not just his condition that grips your attention, it is the weight of his legacy. His body is not just a medical curiosity. It is a symbol, a grotesque reminder of everything that went wrong with his rule. The scars left by his obsession, the pain caused by his dysfunction, the years of suffering borne by his wives, all of it is wrapped up in this moment. You are not just tasked with preserving his body, you are tasked with preserving a history, a dark history that spans the entire length of Ferdinand's reign. The deeper you look, the more you realize that Ferdinand's condition is not just a personal flaw. It is the very manifestation of the political and social decay that gripped Spain under his rule. His physical deformity was a reflection of the kingdom's dysfunction. A kingdom that was plagued by its inability to evolve, to adapt, to produce something better than the twisted legacy that Ferdinand represented. And in this moment, you are confronted with that Ligusia monstrous thing that seems to have taken on a life of its own. Your hands tremble as you begin the task of preserving the body. As you work, your mind races. The Queen's words echo in your ears. This is not just a royal body. This is a symbol, a thing beyond the bounds of nature. What does she mean by that? What is she asking you to preserve? With every movement, you feel the weight of her request. It is not just about preserving a body, it is about preserving the very legacy of a kingdom, a history marked by cruelty, by obsession, by a king who became consumed by his own insecurities. As a physician, you were taught to look beyond the surface, to understand the cause of illness, to seek out the root of suffering. But what you are facing now is beyond your understanding. Ferdinand's legacy is not just a medical puzzle, it is a curse that has haunted Spain for generations. And now, standing in this room, you are part of that curse. You are the one who will preserve it. You are the one who will ensure that the story of Ferdinand II, his monstrous legacy, will never be forgotten. The dim, flickering candlelight dances against the stone walls, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. You work in silence, your hands careful and deliberate as you continue your task. But beneath the quiet, something far more unsettling stirs the weight of Ferdinand's secret. Now exposed in the very room that once shielded it, the walls themselves seem to hold their breath, as though they too are afraid of the truth that now lies bare before you. As you handle the king's body with precision, your thoughts wander. The palace, for all its grandeur and splendor, is a place of secrets. It always has been. The royal court, so full of pomp and ceremony, is also a theater of whispered rumors, of power plays veiled in smiles and polite conversation. Here, in the grand halls, behind the locked doors, the true nature of Spain's monarchy has always been hidden. And now, in this moment, you are part of that hidden history, part of the very fabric of a kingdom that has long struggled with its own monstrous truths. Ferdinand's condition, his physical anomaly, his shameful legacy was never truly spoken of, not in the open, not in the way that one might speak of a royal scandal. It was too grotesque, too bizarre to be acknowledged openly, and yet you know that it has always been a topic of hushed conversations. Whispers that drifted through the palace corridors, through the kitchens, through the halls where servants and courtiers exchanged the kind of gossip that only the elite could afford to keep hidden. There, in the shadows, his body was both a subject of morbid curiosity and a symbol of something far darker, curse that had haunted his reign. You had heard the rumors over the years, those whispers that carried through the halls of the palace, like a secret that everyone knew but no one dared speak aloud. Ferdinand's condition was never a subject for polite conversation. It was the unspoken truth, the thing that people pretended didn't exist. The courtiers would smile and nod, but behind closed doors, their conversations would turn to the king's most private problem, the one no one could deny. the one that stained his entire legacy. Some said that the king's body had been cursed by the gods themselves, that it was a punishment for the sins of his family, an embodiment of the genetic decay that had plagued the Habsburg and Bourbon bloodlines for generations. Others whispered that his condition was a direct result of the cruel, incestuous marriages that had shaped his bloodline. The Spanish monarchy, after all, had long been marked by such unions, each marriage more inbred than the last. Ferdinand's mother, Maria Louisa of Parma, had been the product of generations of cousin marriages, and it was said that Ferdinand's condition was proof of the genetic toll that such unions had taken on the royal family. The whispers spoke of a history steeped in shame, history that had remained hidden from the public eye, but was very much alive behind the palace walls. There were rumors of special cushions, strange contraptions created by royal craftsmen to accommodate Ferdinand's deformity during his most intimate moments. There were stories of wives who had screamed in terror, of courtiers who had been forced to pretend that the king's body was normal, that his monstrous condition was not the source of endless humiliation. And, perhaps most unsettling of all, there were stories of Ferdinand's desperate attempts to find a solution, to cure himself of his anatomical curse, each attempt more bizarre than the last. As you continue your work, you find yourself haunted by the stories you've heard. The whispers from the courtiers seem to echo in your mind, growing louder with each passing moment. Ferdinand's grotesque condition was not merely a physical flouet, was a reflection of the inner turmoil that had consumed him throughout his life. His reign, marked by cruelty, paranoia, and a desperate obsession with producing an heir, was driven in part by his need to control his own body, to prove to himself and to the world that he was not defined by his deformity. But in doing so, he became a prisoner of his own insecurities, a man whose personal failures bled into the very fabric of his rule. The palace staff, too, had their own stories to tell. The servants who attended to the king in his most private moments whispered among themselves about the strange and unnatural preparations that were made before the royal marriage nights, the custom-made cushions, the oils, the special arrangements. It was as though the act of intimacy had become a clinical procedure, a task that required more than just a willing participant. It was a process, a ritual that served to underscore just how far removed Ferdinand's life had become from anything resembling normalcy. But there were also darker stories of wives who had been forced to endure the king's grotesque condition, of their suffering and humiliation, of their growing despair as the years went on without any success in producing an heir. Ferdinand's marriages were not the romantic unions one might expect of a royal family. They were more akin to medical experiments, clinical trials in which the king's wives were subjected to the same twisted rituals again and again, all in the name of royal succession. And as the years passed, the rumors grew. There were whispers, of poison whispers, that Ferdinand had become so obsessed with producing an heir that he would stop at nothing to achieve his goal. The idea that his wives, his potential heirs, might be sabotaging the process became a consuming thought for Ferdinand. Each failure was not just a personal tragedy, but a political one. He was convinced that his wife's reluctance, their fear, their disgust, had somehow hindered their ability to conceive. And so, with each failed attempt, Ferdinand became more desperate, more paranoid, until the very idea of intimacy had become a source of dread for everyone involved. As you work in the dim light, you can almost hear the whispers of the courtiers, the muffled conversations that took place in the corners of the palace, the scandalous stories that were passed from one servant to another, from one noble to the next. it is impossible not to feel the weight of those secrets pressing down on you. You realize that, in many ways, Ferdinand's body is not just a curiosity, it is a symbol of everything that has gone wrong with the monarchy. It is a reminder of the rot that has set in, both within the royal family and within the kingdom itself. The more you think about it, the more you realize that Ferdinand's legacy is far from simple. It is a legacy of power, yes, but also of shame. A legacy that was built on a foundation of secrecy, on whispers and lies, on a body that could not fulfill its natural purpose. And now, you are the one tasked with preserving that legacy, with making sure that history does not forget the man who ruled Spain with an iron fist and whose most private failures became the source of his downfall. To understand Ferdinand II, you must first understand the very foundation of his existence, a foundation marred by centuries of royal inbreeding. The Spanish, Habsburgs and Bourbons, like many European royal families, had long indulged in the practice of cousin marriages, uniting bloodlines to preserve power and consolidate wealth. But in doing so, they had created a dynasty cursed by its own genetic decisions. Each generation a fragile vessel for the diseases, deformities, and madness passed down through the bloodline. Ferdinand, born on October 14, 1784, in the grand surroundings of El Escorial Palace, was the product of such a marriage. His parents, Charles IV of Spain and Maria Louisa of Parma, were first cousins, both born into the same web of royal marriages that had linked Europe's ruling families for generations. From the moment of his birth, Ferdinand's life was already marked by the invisible hand of inbreeding, a hand that would shape every aspect of his existence. The Habsburgs, once the most powerful royal family in Europe, had long practiced this insular form of marital politics, but with each passing generation, the consequences became more apparent. The family tree grew increasingly twisted as cousins married cousins, and the royal bloodlines became increasingly tainted. Ferdinand's own lineage was deeply marred by this practice. His father, Charles IV, was himself a product of inbreeding. His mother, Maria Louisa, came from a long line of intermarriage within the royal families of Europe. This toxic combination of royal blood was never meant to withstand the pressures of time, and Ferdinand, born from these bloodlines, would come to personify the catastrophic result of such unions. From the moment Ferdinand was born, those around him could see the signs. He was, in many ways, a living embodiment of his family's decline. His appearance was striking, but not in the way one might expect of royalty. He had an angular face, sharp features, and dark, intense eyes that always seemed to be searching for something, even as a child. But it was his physical abnormalities that became the most apparent as he grew older. His body, though royal in stature, was marked by the same defects that had plagued his forebears. His legs were weaker than those of most children, and his body grew at an uneven rate. His condition was never more evident than in the development of his most notorious feature, the grotesque anatomical anomaly that would haunt his every waking moment. As Ferdinand reached puberty, the medical realities of his condition became increasingly apparent. His male anatomy began to grow at an alarming rate, the proportions defying natural laws. His member, larger than any seen before, began to take on an unusual shape, with strange twists and bulges that defied any biological explanation. The physicians who attended to him were baffled, their confusion deepening as they watched the young prince develop into a man whose body seemed to defy the basic tenets of human anatomy. Ferdinand's condition was not something that could be hidden. It became the subject of hushed whispers among the court physicians, who spoke of it in clinical terms, their reports hidden away in private letters and secret notes. One physician, Dr. Francisco Flores, left behind detailed notes about Ferdinand's anatomical condition. His Royal Highness is afflicted with a member of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form that intimate relations may prove challenging. He wrote. Another physician, more blunt in his observations, described Ferdinand's anatomy as resembling nothing so much as a billiard cue, thin as sealing wax at its base, thick as a man's fist at its extremity, and long enough to serve as a walking stick. The implications of Ferdinand's condition were clear from an early age. In a society where male anatomy was often judged by classical Greek standards, where smaller was seen as more refined, more aristocratic, Ferdinand's massive and misshapen endowment marked him as a freak of nature. It became a source of profound shame for him, a part of his body that he could neither control nor hide. His self-consciousness about it grew as he entered adolescence, and the court's gossip and mockery only deepened his shame. Ferdinand had become an object of ridicule, not only for his strange deformity, but also for the sheer impossibility of living with such a condition. His father, Charles IV, took little interest in his son's suffering, too preoccupied with his own failures as king. His mother, Maria Louisa, showed little sympathy. Her attention focused on her own affairs, including her well-documented affair with the Prime Minister, Manuel de Godoy, for Ferdinand. The royal court became a place of constant humiliation. Servants would whisper behind his back, court physicians would exchange knowing glances, and foreign diplomats would report back to their masters about Spain's shameful prince. The boy who would one day rule over the Spanish Empire had become an object of mockery, and in the isolation that followed, his paranoia began to grow. Ferdinand learned early that his body would define his life, not his mind, not his accomplishments, but the grotesque deformity that he had inherited. The whispers about Ferdinand's condition continued to spread throughout the royal court, and as he grew older, his paranoia became more pronounced. He began to mistrust everyone, his servants, his tutors, even his own family. He saw mockery in every glance, every gesture. What others might have considered normal behavior, he interpreted as insults. He began to feel that the entire world was laughing at him, and the more isolated he became, the more power he sought to protect himself from the humiliation he could not escape. In his mind, his deformity had become more than just a physical burden. It was the key to understanding his entire reign. His obsession with producing an heir, his cruel treatment of his wives, his growing desperation, these were all linked to the unspoken truth about his body. The king who ruled over Spain with an iron fist was, at his core, a man consumed by his own physical inadequacy, unable to reconcile his body with his ambitions. But Ferdinand was not the only victim of his family's genetic legacy. The entire Spanish royal family had been ravaged by the consequences of inbreeding, with each new generation carrying the weight of their predecessors' mistakes. Ferdinand's condition, grotesque as it was merely the most visible manifestation of a much larger problem, one that would continue to haunt the Spanish monarchy for generations to come. And as you stand there, your hands still trembling as you work on preserving his body, you are struck by the chilling realization that Ferdinand's life and reign were not just the result of a single man's failure. They were the product of a bloodline that had been poisoned by generations of royal inbreeding. His condition was not just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger disease, one that had seeped into the very fabric of Spain's royal family. Childhood was not one of joyous moments or royal celebrations. The grandeur of the Spanish court, with its opulence and wealth, may have seemed like a dream to many, but for Ferdinand, it was a nightmare. His early years were spent not in the company of other children, but in isolation, shunned and ridiculed by those around him. His deformity, which would come to define him as an adult, was already present in his youth, but at the time, it was only whispered about behind closed doors. The court was full of secrets. His condition, one of the most closely guarded from the day of his birth, Ferdinand had been the subject of suspicion and judgment. His parents, Charles IV and Maria Louisa, were more preoccupied with their own issues than with the well-being of their son. Charles IV was a man who had little interest in the governance of Spain, and Maria Louisa, although devoted to her son, was distracted by her own political affairs and her notorious affair with Manuel de Godoy, the de facto ruler of Spain. The court, ever the hotbed of intrigue, offered little solace to the young prince. He was left to navigate a world of political machinations, familial dysfunction, and royal expectations. But it was Ferdinand's body, his physical condition, that shaped his childhood most profoundly. As a young boy, he was already acutely aware of the whispers that followed him, of the furtive glances cast in his direction when people thought he was not looking. The courtiers, the servants, the royal family, they all knew, even if they dared not speak of it openly. Ferdinand's deformity was not just a private matter, it was a public spectacle, one that followed him everywhere he went. He would sometimes catch the eyes of his tutors, who seemed to avoid meeting his gaze. He noticed the way that some of the ladies-in-waiting would speak of him in hushed tones, pretending not to notice the awkwardness in his presence. The boys who played in the palace gardens with him would laugh and make crude jokes about him, their laughter stinging in a way that Ferdinand would never forget. The taunts were always subtle at first, mere whispers behind his back, but they grew louder as he aged, until they became impossible to ignore. By the time Ferdinand reached adolescence, his self-consciousness had become a burden that he could no longer carry alone. His body, once the subject of quiet ridicule, had grown even more grotesque, his deformity more pronounced. His member, which had started to develop abnormally at a young age, continued to grow at an alarming rate. The shape of it, the strange curves and bulges, seemed to defy all natural laws. And as his body continued to change, so too did his understanding of himself. Ferdinand had always been a sensitive boy, and he could sense the way that people looked at him, first with pity, then with disgust. It became clear to him that his body was the thing that defined him, not his royal lineage, not his intellect, but his deformity. In an era when masculinity was often defined by physical appearance, by the strength of one's body and the power it wielded, Ferdinand was doomed to live in the shadow of his own physical inadequacy. The reality of his condition, one that no physician could explain, became his greatest source of shame. But it was not just his body that tormented him. Ferdinand's psychological state began to deteriorate as he aged. The humiliation he experienced daily at court, in the presence of his family, and even from his tutors, took its toll. He became withdrawn, secretive, and increasingly paranoid. The young prince, once full of hope and promise, began to withdraw into himself, hiding from the world that had mocked him. Ferdinand's paranoia was rooted in more than just his deformity, was also a reflection of the atmosphere that surrounded him. The royal court was a place of constant scheming, of betrayal, and of power struggles. His father, Charles IV, was weak-willed and uninterested in the affairs of state, while his mother, Maria Louisa, was more focused on her affair with Godoy than on her son's well-being. The lack of parental guidance and support left Ferdinand feeling abandoned, as though he were a prisoner of his own family, trapped by the very people who were supposed to protect him. It was during these formative years that Ferdinand began to develop his deep-seated resentment for those around him. He saw the court, with its scheming courtiers and whispering servants, as a world full of people who either ignored his suffering or reveled in it. The constant mockery, even if subtle, began to eat away at his sense of self. He learned early on that he could not rely on others for validation, for comfort, or even for love. His deformity had made him an outcast, and the more he was rejected by those around him, the more he began to rely on his own power to compensate for his inner weakness. As a result, Ferdinand became increasingly tyrannical, using his royal position to exert control over those who could not escape him. He began to lash out at those who crossed him, punishing them with cruelty and vindictiveness. The servants who displeased him were punished severely, often losing their positions or worse. Ferdinand's temper grew more unpredictable, and the paranoia that had taken root in his youth blossomed into full-blown madness. His tutors, who once treated him with patience and care, began to notice the disturbing changes in his behavior. The prince became increasingly secretive, withdrawing from the company of others, hiding in his chambers for days at a time. He became obsessed with power, using his position to dominate those around him. The kindness he had once shown to his servants and tutors evaporated, replaced by cruelty and resentment. His deformity, which had once been a source of personal humiliation, had now become a symbol of his need to control everything and everyone around him. Ferdinand's self-hatred deepened, and he began to see himself as a victim of fate, a man cursed by the very body that was supposed to signify his power. His inability to control his physical condition only exacerbated his feelings of impotence and frustration. In his mind, he was not just a king whose body betrayed him. He was a king whose very existence had been ruined by fate, by blood, by the twisted legacy of his ancestors. And so, as he grew older, he began to compensate for this weakness by lashing out at those who could not fight back. It was during these adolescent years that the first signs of his eventual descent into tyranny began to emerge. Ferdinand's insecurity, his shame, and his growing paranoia would go on to shape the rest of his life. The boy who had once been full of hope and possibility was now a man consumed by his own demons, a man whose deformity had become the lens through which he saw the entire world. As Ferdinand entered his adulthood, the court was already a place of whispered rumors and hushed conversations, each passing year marking a new chapter in the saga of his deformity. But this was more than just a story about a physical abnormality. It was a tragic narrative about a man who had come to define his entire identity by his body, a man whose sense of self had been twisted and fractured by the very thing he could not control. Ferdinand's deformity had become his prison, one he could neither escape nor overcome. And the cruel irony was that the more he tried to exert control over his kingdom, the more he became consumed by his own inadequacies. Royalty, from the outside, might appear to be a life of privilege, of power, and of luxury. But the reality of Ferdinand's life was far from glamorous. His physical condition had not just been a private suffering. It was a public one, something that affected every aspect of his existence. While others at court carried on with their lives, Ferdinand had to live with the constant reminder of his deformity of the body that had been passed down to him, the body that had been shaped by generations of royal inbreeding. It wasn't just his physical deformity that made Ferdinand a prisoner in his own life. It was the psychological toll it had taken on him. His increasing paranoia made him distrust everyone around him, even those who had sworn loyalty to him. He saw conspiracies in every whisper, every passing glance, and every slight. What had begun as an internal battle with his own body, had grown into an all-consuming war against the world itself. Ferdinand's interactions with others became increasingly strained, as he sought to control every situation, every conversation, every look that might be directed his way. The psychological strain began to manifest in his actions. No longer the child who had once been humiliated by his peers, Ferdinand became a man whose cruelty knew no bounds. He began to lash out at those closest to him, especially the servants and courtiers who could not escape his presence. Those who displeased him, no matter how minor the infraction, found themselves dismissed, punished, or even exiled from the palace. His reaction to the slightest inconvenience was swift and violent, a direct result of the overwhelming sense of powerlessness he felt when confronted with his own body. The more he tried to assert control, the more violent and unpredictable his behavior became. The psychological toll of Ferdinand's deformity was also evident in his marriage arrangements. As he reached marriageable age, the full scope of his physical challenge became apparent to those around him. Royal physicians, in whispered tones, discussed the impossibility of Ferdinand ever producing an heir under normal circumstances. But the king's obsession with producing a successor, with securing Spain's future, outweighed all practical considerations. As Ferdinand began to contemplate marriage, his mind was consumed by thoughts of his deformity. His body, once a source of shame, had now become a symbol of his entire existence. The pressure to produce an heir was immense, not just for the sake of the kingdom, but for his own self-worth. He had spent his youth in a constant battle with his own body, and now, as a king, he had to prove that he could overcome the physical curse that had been handed down to him. The royal physicians, too, were caught in a web of secrecy. They had spent years dealing with Ferdinand's condition, creating custom-designed aids and seeking out any possible treatments that might alleviate his suffering or improve his ability to father an heir. But no matter how much effort they poured into finding a solution, the reality was always the same. Ferdinand's deformity was not something that could be fixed. No amount of medical intervention could change the basic nature of his body. Instead, the court relied on secrecy, on subtle whispers, and on strategies that allowed Ferdinand to carry on the facade of a king who was capable of fulfilling his royal duties. Custom-made cushions were designed for his bedchamber, and special supports were crafted for the wedding night, all designed to accommodate his grotesque condition. These strange medical devices were a testament to the lengths to which the royal court was willing to go to protect the king's dignity and preserve the myth of his royal masculinity. But even as these preparations were made, the psychological toll of Ferdinand's deformity became impossible to ignore. His paranoia continued to grow. Fed by the isolation he felt from his own body and the constant reminders of his physical inadequacy, the court had become a place of tension and fear, where Ferdinand's outbursts were increasingly unpredictable, and where his cruelty was a constant presence. As his first marriage approaches, Ferdinand is consumed by his need for control. The preparations for the wedding night are nothing like a normal royal marriage. There is no romance, no anticipation, only cold, calculated measures to ensure that the physical act of intimacy can be carried out without harm. The custom-made cushions, the oils, the strange implements, all of these things are a desperate attempt to bridge the vast chasm between Ferdinand's physical reality and the expectations of his royal duties. The wedding night, however, is far from the idealized vision of romance and succession that Ferdinand had hoped for. His first wife, Maria Antonia of Naples, enters the marriage full of naive expectations, unaware of the grotesque challenges that lie ahead. When she first sees her husband's body, her reaction is one of horror reaction that mirrors the disgust Ferdinand himself feels but has long kept hidden. The first night is not one of love but of clinical necessity, a forced union made bearable only through a strange, surgical-like process that leaves both Ferdinand and Maria Antonia emotionally scarred. As the marriage continues, Ferdinand's paranoia deepens. His insecurities, fueled by his deformity, cause him to distrust Maria Antonia, and soon, he begins to question her every move. He accuses her of deliberately avoiding the act of conception, convinced that her reluctance is preventing him from producing an heir. His treatment of her grows more cruel with each passing day, and the marriage becomes a battleground, with Ferdinand constantly trying to assert his control over the situation. But the true tragedy of Ferdinand's reign is not just his inability to produce an heir, it is the toll his deformity has taken on his mind. The more he struggles with his body, the more he turns inward, consumed by shame, paranoia, and a deep sense of inadequacy. His deformity is no longer just a physical condition, it is the lens through which he sees the entire world. And as he continues to fail in his attempts to fulfill his royal duty, the more he becomes convinced that his body, his very existence, is a reflection of the collapse of the monarchy itself. The royal court, a palace of gilded halls and grand tapestries, is not the haven of power and stability that the world perceives it to be. Behind the lavish exterior, the palace is a house of whispers, where every step, every word is laden with suspicion and fear. The courtiers, once the proud servants of Spain's monarchy, are reduced to actors in a play where the script is written, not by duty, but by paranoia, shame, and the need to conceal the family's most grotesque secret. As Ferdinand's mental state deteriorates, so too does his grip on the court. He once held the power of a king, a monarch with the authority to command respect and loyalty. But now, the very people who serve him are trapped in a web of distrust. They must smile and bow, nodding politely as they are forced to carry out their duties under the watchful eye of a man who has become increasingly unpredictable. Each decision, each gesture is scrutinized by Ferdinand, who has become consumed by the need to control every aspect of his world. The courtiers, once the heart of the Spanish aristocracy, have become pawns in a game they can neither understand nor escape. Ferdinand's paranoia has seeped into every corner of the palace, infecting even the smallest interactions. He watches them, all his servants, his advisors, even his closest family members, wondering, always wondering, who among them is conspiring against him, who among them is laughing at him, who knows his secret and will use it to destroy him. As the king's mental state grows more fragile, the courtiers are forced to adapt to his erratic behavior. They have learned the delicate art of navigating the palace's treacherous waters. Their smiles are carefully practiced, their words measured. They speak in whispers, lest their voices betray them. They exchange subtle looks, understanding one another's silent language. In Ferdinand's court, silence is a form of power. The less you say, the less you reveal, the safer you are. The royal physicians, too, are caught in this web of deception. They have been with Ferdinand for years, tending to his body, attempting to understand the mysteries of his condition. But their work is not just medical, it is political. They are bound not only by their oaths as doctors, but by their allegiance to the crown. They must keep Ferdinand's secrets, for to reveal the truth would be to destroy the monarchy itself. They are no strangers to the king's cruelty. The royal physicians have long been forced to work in the shadows, creating bizarre medical aids, experimenting with potions and treatments that are more superstition than science. They have crafted cushions to accommodate Ferdinand's deformity, designed contraptions to ease the pain of his condition, all in the hopes of fulfilling the king's desperate desire for a son. They have seen the toll that Ferdinand's condition has taken on his psyche, yet they dare not speak of it openly. Their allegiance to the crown demands that they remain silent, even as their hearts grow heavy with the weight of their complicity. As Ferdinand's paranoia deepens, he begins to make increasingly erratic decisions, and his once sympathetic physicians are drawn into his spiraling madness. He orders more tests, more examinations, desperate for answers that will never come. He demands new treatments, new potions, new remedies, none of which will ever change the truth of his condition. The royal physicians, trapped by their duty, become unwilling participants in a medical theater that has no resolution, no cure. They perform their tasks with precision, but their hearts are weighed down with the knowledge that nothing they do can fix what is broken in their king. The court, too, is increasingly aware of the king's mental state. His behavior, once a matter of curiosity, has now become a source of fear. The whispers grow louder, and courtiers begin to fear the king's wrath. Anyone who crosses him, even in the smallest of ways, risks incurring his fury. His temper is unpredictable, and his punishments grow increasingly severe. Servants who make the slightest mistake are dismissed, often in disgrace. Those who fail to meet the king's expectations are exiled from Madrid, banished to remote corners of the empire. Ferdinand's cruelty knows no bounds, and no one is safe from his wrath. The once proud aristocracy of Spain has been reduced to a shadow of its former self. The court is no longer a place of power and prestige, it has become a place of survival. The courtiers are forced to navigate a labyrinth of intrigue, never knowing who they can trust. Ferdinand's paranoia has turned his court into a volatile powder keg, waiting to explode at the slightest provocation. And yet, despite the growing tension, there is a strange, almost surreal beauty to it all. The court, with its grand ceremonies and royal pageantry, still clings to its former glory. The halls are adorned with portraits of past monarchs, their eyes following you as you walk through the palace. The floors are polished to a gleaming sheen, and the air is thick with the scent of roses and incense. But beneath this facade lies the truth of Ferdinand's reign defined not by strength and power, but by fear and fragility. In this world of secrets, Ferdinand remains the central figure, the man whose every move is scrutinized, whose every word is weighed for its hidden meaning. He is a king who once ruled with absolute authority, but now he is a prisoner of his own paranoia, trapped in a palace of lies. The courtiers who serve him, once loyal and proud, are now mere shadows. In his world, they walk on eggshells, afraid to offend, afraid to reveal the truth. They are bound by their duty, but also by the deep, unspoken knowledge that they, too, are trapped in this world of secrets. For Ferdinand, the royal court is no longer a symbol of his power. It is a reflection of his broken mind, his fractured soul. The court may appear to function outwardly, but inwardly it is consumed by his madness. The very institution that once embodied the grandeur of Spain has become a place of suffering and fear, a place where the king's secret is never spoken but is always felt. And as you work to preserve the body of this broken king, you are reminded, once again, of the irony of it all. Ferdinand's legacy, his reign, and his life were all shaped by a body that he could neither control nor understand. And now, as you prepare to seal his body in the tomb of history, you are left with one final question. Can a man truly be remembered for anything beyond the body he was born with? Can a king, whose life was marked by such personal shame, ever be truly remembered as more than a monster of his own making? Ferdinand's reign, once marked by promise, soon became synonymous with cruelty. His deformity, which had plagued him since birth, had now become the defining feature of his life and rule. It was no longer just the physical burden of his condition that weighed on him, it was the unbearable psychological toll it took, warping his mind into something darker and more dangerous. No longer able to bear the constant shame of his body, Ferdinand sought to dominate the world around him, using fear and intimidation as his weapons of choice. The royal court, once a place of elegance and order, had now become a breeding ground for dread. Ferdinand's increasing paranoia turned every aspect of his rule into a power struggle, with courtiers and servants alike living in constant fear of offending the king, no matter how innocuous the transgression. No one in the palace was safe from his wrath, not even those closest to him. His cruelty was unpredictable, often erupting in violent outbursts over the smallest perceived slight. Servants, those who had once been able to serve him with dignity, now trembled in his presence. A careless glance, an accidental misstep, could lead to a swift and harsh punishment. Ferdinand's whims were his law, and those who disobeyed him suffered the consequences. The most minor of offenses, things that would have been dismissed under any other ruler, were met with swift and brutal retribution. And the king's cruelty didn't stop at the servants. Even the nobles, those whose families had long held sway in Spain's royal court, were not immune from his ire. One incident, recorded by a court chaplain, exemplifies Ferdinand's growing tyranny. A young page, in the middle of his duties, had unknowingly entered the royal chambers while the king was changing clothes. The young man, unaware of what he was witnessing, froze in shock at the sight of Ferdinand's exposed body. Rather than offering the boy leniency, Ferdinand's response was immediate and unforgiving. The young page was not merely dismissed from his duties, he was publicly flogged and exiled from Madrid, his family forced to leave the city in disgrace. This is where Ferdinand's tyranny began to take root. His deformity, once a private source of shame, had now become a public symbol of his authority. To Ferdinand, anyone who saw his body in its true form was a threat, one that had to be silenced at all costs. The page's accidental glimpse was not just a breach of royal etiquette, it was an insult to his very identity, and such insults would not be tolerated. The royal court, already filled with whispers and gossip, was now a place where fear reigned supreme. The once celebrated halls of the palace, filled with art and music, now echoed with the sound of nervous footsteps. Courtiers began to speak in code, aware that their every word, every gesture, could be misinterpreted as a threat or an insult. Ferdinand's outbursts were so unpredictable that even the most trusted servants were unsure of how to behave in his presence. His cruelty had turned the palace into a place of constant tension, where no one could escape the king's unrelenting gaze. Even his own family was not spared from his wrath. Ferdinand's relationship with his mother, Maria Louisa, became increasingly strained. The Queen, once a symbol of grace and diplomacy, was now forced to walk on eggshells around her son, Ferdinand's. Suspicions about everyone around him were so deep that he even turned on his own relatives. His mother, already struggling with the emotional toll of her affair with Godoy, found herself at odds with her son. Ferdinand, who had once been a child, in need of maternal love, now saw his mother as just another potential threat, someone whose actions could be interpreted as betrayal. But it wasn't just his family who suffered. Ferdinand's treatment of his wives became even more disturbing as his mental state deteriorated. His first wife, Maria Antonia, had already been subjected to the strange and humiliating rituals of their wedding night, but it didn't end there. The pressure to produce an heir, to fulfill the expectations of the Spanish throne, consumed Ferdinand. His desire for control over every aspect of their relationship grew more obsessive, and his cruelty, once hidden beneath the surface, began to manifest itself in increasingly grotesque ways. The marriage was nothing like the romantic union Ferdinand had once dreamed of. It was a medical experiment, a strange, clinical process designed not to bring the two closer, but to facilitate the production of an heir. Ferdinand's insecurities, fueled by his deformity, had created a wedge between him and his wife, a wedge that could not be crossed. Every attempt to conceive was marred by Ferdinand's need for absolute control, from the custom-designed cushions to the medical devices that were used to assist the act of intimacy. Maria Antonia, trapped in this grotesque cycle, began to withdraw into herself, her health deteriorating under the strain of the physical and emotional toll. Ferdinand's cruel behavior did not end with his first marriage. His second wife, Maria Isabel, was subjected to the same horrors. The medical interventions, the strange rituals, the obsessive focus on producing an heir, they all played out once again, but with a sense of increasing desperation. The king's cruelty had not diminished over the years. If anything, it had grown worse, more refined in its terror. He had become a man whose every action was dictated by fear of his own body, fear of his failure as a ruler, and fear of the judgment that awaited him if he could not produce a successor. His need for control was so overwhelming that it began to affect his political decisions. As Ferdinand's paranoia grew, so did his distrust of those around him. He saw conspiracies everywhere, even in the most innocent of actions. Every advisor, every noble, every servant became a potential threat to his reign. His cruel treatment of those closest to him extended beyond the personal realm. It infected the very structure of the government. Decisions were made not based on reason or logic, but on Ferdinand's emotional state. And as his mental health deteriorated, so too did the stability of his kingdom. Ferdinand had once been a young prince with promise, a man who was supposed to lead Spain into a new era of prosperity. But now, as his cruelty and paranoia began to take hold, he became a tyrant, a man whose reign was defined by fear, cruelty, and madness. His body, once a source of shame, had now become the catalyst for his darkest impulses. The deformity that had consumed his life from childhood was now the force that shaped his rule, a constant reminder of the fragility of his mind and the corrupting nature of absolute power. The kingdom that Ferdinand once hoped to lead was now a shadow of its former self, crumbling under the weight of his cruelty. And as the years passed, the whispers grew louder. The world outside the palace began to take notice of the king's deteriorating mental state. The once proud monarchy was beginning to fall apart, and Ferdinand's cruelty would be the legacy that defined his reign. The royal wedding of Ferdinand and Maria Antonia of Naples was meant to be a grand affair, the union of two powerful families, one that would seal the future of Spain and secure its bloodline for generations to come. The streets of Madrid were lined with flowers, and the royal palace glistened with gold and jewels. The bells rang out, heralding a new chapter in Spain's history. Yet, as with so many royal marriages, this one was built not on love, but on duty that was imposed upon both bride and groom by the demands of the Spanish crown. For Maria Antonia, the day was filled with the naive hope of any young bride. She had been raised in the court of Naples, surrounded by the trappings of royalty, and had been told little about the specifics of married life. She had heard whispers, of course, about her future husband, the heir to the Spanish throne. Some spoke of his intelligence, his charm, and the affection his subjects felt for him. Others, in more hushed tones, spoke of the king's peculiarities, but Maria Antonia, sheltered from the darker side of court life, never paid them much mind. She had been raised to be a queen, and she was determined to fulfill her duty with grace, but nothing could have prepared her for what awaited her on her wedding night. Ferdinand, for all his royal bearing, was not the man he appeared to be in public. He had spent his life hiding the deformity that had plagued him since his childhood, a deformity that had grown worse with age. He had tried to conceal it, to pretend it did not exist, but now, on this night, it would be exposed in the most intimate and humiliating way. Maria Antonia entered the royal bedchamber with all the naivety of a young bride. She had been told that there would be preparations, special cushions, and oils, but she had no idea what they were for. The attendants, nervous and uncomfortable, explained little, and as she entered the room, she saw the strange implements that had been arranged. She would later recall how the sight of the specially designed cushions filled her with unease, though she did not understand why. As Ferdinand entered the chamber, his appearance was nothing like the romantic prince she had imagined. The first glimpse of him, his royal body exposed before her, sent a shockwave through her. His deformity, grotesque in its proportions, was more than she could bear. The way his body had been affected by his condition was not just physical. It was as if it had been marked by nature itself, a cruel reminder of the twisted legacy that had been handed down through the generations of the Spanish monarchy. The sight was more than she could bear, and, according to reports from her attendants, Maria Antonia began to scream, backing away in horror. She was not prepared for the shock of seeing her husband's body in its full, grotesque form. Her reaction was one of pure terror. She had been raised in a world of courtly etiquette where every glance and gesture was measured, where nothing was meant to disturb the decorum of royal life. But this was beyond anything she could have ever imagined. Her screams echoed through the palace corridors, and the ladies in waiting, who had been present in the room, watched in silent horror as the young bride retreated from her husband in disgust. The wedding night, meant to be a sacred and intimate moment for a newlywed couple, became something far darker. It was not the union of two hearts, but a medical procedure, a ritual of pain and discomfort for both Ferdinand and Maria Antonia. Ferdinand, already deeply ashamed of his body, was humiliated further by his bride's reaction. His insecurities, long buried under the weight of royal duty, rose to the surface with a vengeance. He was unable to perform as a husband should, and Maria Antonia, overwhelmed by the trauma of what she had witnessed, could not bring herself to participate in the way the royal court had intended. The physicians, who had been summoned to assist, were forced to intervene. The specially designed cushions were placed under the bride, and oils were applied, all in the hope of making the impossible possible. But no amount of medical intervention could change the reality of Ferdinand's condition. His deformity, so grotesque and abnormal, made intimacy impossible without extreme discomfort and risk. The king's most private shame had now become a public spectacle. one that would haunt both him and his young wife for the rest of their lives. Maria Antonia's reaction to the wedding night was not just one of physical shock, but psychological trauma. Her screams that night were not just cries of fear, but cries of disbelief. She could not reconcile the man she had married with the man who stood before her, exposed and vulnerable. The horror of it all left a permanent mark on her. She could never undo what she had witnessed, and it would define her relationship with Ferdinand from that night onward. In the days that followed, Maria Antonia withdrew further into herself. The young, innocent bride who had arrived in Madrid full of hope and promise was now a broken woman. Her health began to deteriorate, both physically and mentally. The stress of the wedding night, combined with her growing sense of horror and isolation, took its toll. Ferdinand, consumed by his own shame and paranoia, could offer her little comfort. He saw her disgust not as a natural reaction, but as a betrayal of his royal duty, a sign of his failure as a man and a king. The marriage, which had been arranged to secure the future of Spain, was now a source of mutual misery for both parties. Ferdinand's cruelty, which had been hidden beneath his royal facade, began to reveal itself in the way he treated his wife. He saw her refusal to fulfill her duties as a sign of weakness, a failure to live up to the expectations placed upon her as the future Queen of Spain. His insecurity and paranoia, already present in his childhood, now grew into a monstrous force that consumed every aspect of his life. He began to lash out at Maria Antonia, accusing her of deliberately sabotaging their attempts to produce an heir. He saw in her reluctance not just fear, but betrayal. He believed that her disgust was preventing her from doing her duty as the future mother of Spain's heir. The marriage, once a union of royal bloodlines, had become a battlefield. Maria Antonia's despair grew as she realized that her efforts to please her husband were in vain. The more she attempted to fulfill her duties, the more she was met with failure and punishment. Ferdinand, ever the tyrant, began to punish her not just emotionally, but physically. The once dutiful bride had become a prisoner in her own marriage, caught between the demands of royal duty and the reality of her husband's condition. The psychological toll of Ferdinand's deformity on Maria Antonia was profound. She became increasingly withdrawn, her once beautiful features now shadowed by the toll of her trauma. Her health began to suffer, and it became clear to the physicians at court that the stress of her marriage was taking a deadly toll on her body. She grew weaker with each passing month, her strength fading as she battled against the emotional and physical exhaustion of living with Ferdinand's cruelty. In May 1807, at the age of just 21, Maria Antonia died. The official cause of death was listed as a fever, but the truth was far darker. She had died of despair, of a broken spirit, a body worn down by years of suffering at the hands of a man who had once been her husband, but who had become her tormentor. Ferdinand, his cruel behavior once again on full display, showed little grief. He quickly moved on from his first wife's death, searching for a new bride who might produce the heir that had eluded him. Maria Antonia's death, though officially ruled as a natural passing, was the result of a slow and painful destruction one that had begun the moment she was forced into a marriage with a man whose body was as broken as his mind. Ferdinand's second marriage to Maria Isabel of Portugal in 1816 was not a union based on love or mutual affection. It was another desperate attempt to secure an heir, a goal that had eluded him for so long. The tragic irony of his life was that, despite all his efforts, his body, his deformity, had made him incapable of fulfilling the most basic duty of a king, producing an heir to continue the dynasty. But Ferdinand, consumed by his obsessive desire to have a child, was determined to try again. His second wife, Maria Isabel, would become the unfortunate victim of his relentless drive to prove his masculinity. And like Maria Antonia before her, she would suffer in ways that no woman should. Maria Isabel, only 19 years old when she arrived in Madrid, was full of the naive hope that accompanies young brides. She had heard the rumors about her husband, of course, but had dismissed them as exaggerations. She arrived at court, eager to fulfill her role as the Queen of Spain and to secure her place in history as the mother of Spain's heir. But from the moment she met Ferdinand, it became clear that this would not be a typical royal marriage. The preparations for the wedding night were not those of a typical couple. There were no romantic gestures, no sense of excitement or anticipation. Instead, Maria Isabel was met with cold, clinical arrangements designed to help Ferdinand carry out the one duty he believed he had left, to produce an heir. The marriage night began as it had with Maria Antonia. Strange cushions were placed on the bed, oils were applied to ensure the process could continue with as little discomfort as possible. And Ferdinand's royal physicians, who had once crafted similar devices for his first wife, were again called into action. There was no room for tenderness or love in this union. It was a mechanical process, devoid of affection and warmth. Ferdinand's deformity, once again, was the obstacle that stood between him and his royal duty. His wife, Maria Isabel, found herself in a situation where she was not the bride, but a medical subject and unwilling participant in a ritual that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with control and desperation. When Ferdinand and Maria Isabel first met, she was struck by his appearance, not just by his regal bearing, but by the unspoken pain that seemed to radiate from him. He was a king, yes, but he was also a man who had been broken by his own body, a man whose dignity had been stripped away by the deformity that he could not control. His insecurities were apparent in every interaction, in every glance he cast her way. What should have been a joyful moment, a new beginning for both of them, was overshadowed by Ferdinand's obsession with his deformity and his failure to produce an heir. His body had become an obstacle, a reminder of his failure as a king. And Maria Isabel was now caught in the middle of this desperate pursuit. Maria Isabel's wedding night was not a night of joy or romance, but of horror and confusion. As she lay in bed, unable to fully understand the strange medical procedures unfolding before her, she began to fear what lay ahead. Ferdinand, aware of her reluctance, became more insistent. He believed that her resistance was preventing him from fulfilling his royal duty. In his mind, his deformity was something that could be fixed, something that could be conquered, if only his wives would cooperate. And so, with each failed attempt, his anger and frustration grew, and his cruelty became more pronounced. Maria Isabel had no idea what she had married into. She had been told of Ferdinand's obsession with producing an heir, but nothing could have prepared her for the grim reality of their life together. The strange rituals, the custom-made cushions, the reliance on medical aids, all of it felt more like a medical procedure than a marriage. She had been raised to fulfill her duty as a queen, to provide Spain with an heir, but this was not the path she had imagined. Her every move was scrutinized, her every action examined for signs of success or failure. The pressure mounted with each passing month, and her spirit began to crack under the strain. The psychological toll of Ferdinand's condition on Maria Isabel was immense. She had no power over the situation. She was trapped in a marriage that was more about duty than affection. Ferdinand, unable to see her as a person, but only as a tool to fulfill his royal obligations, began to treat her with increasing cruelty. He became obsessed with her body, demanding that she submit to his will, to his needs, without any consideration for her emotional or physical well-being. He accused her of being incapable of fulfilling her duty, just as he had accused Maria Antonia before her. The same cycle of despair and humiliation began to unfold again. The marriage, which had once held the promise of securing the Spanish monarchy's future, was quickly becoming a nightmare. Ferdinand, unable to control his deformity, turned his frustration and anger on his young wife. The lack of an heir, which he blamed entirely on Maria Isabel, became a source of constant tension between them. He pushed her harder, demanding more, and in the process, he pushed her further away. Maria Isabel, once a bright and hopeful young woman, began to wither under the constant pressure. The pain she endured, both physical and emotional, was something no one could understand, least of all Ferdinand. His inability to produce an heir was not just a personal failure. It was a political disaster that could jeopardize the future of the Spanish throne. And Maria Isabel was now a prisoner to his obsessive drive. The physical toll on Maria Isabel was just the beginning. As the months passed without a successful pregnancy, Ferdinand's obsession grew. He began to consult more physicians, more quack doctors, desperate to find any solution, no matter how bizarre. The court was filled with alchemists and herbalists, all promising miracle cures, but none of them could help. His body had become a prison of its own, a prison that no amount of money or power could change. But the real tragedy of Maria Isabel's situation was not just the physical toll, it was the emotional and psychological devastation she suffered at the hands of her husband. As her health began to deteriorate, the court physicians became concerned. But Ferdinand refused to acknowledge the toll his cruelty was taking on his wife. He believed with every fiber of his being that Maria Isabel's failure to conceive was the result of her refusal to cooperate. He did not see the toll it was taking on her mind, on her body, and on her spirit. As Maria Isabel's health continued to decline, Ferdinand became more desperate. He saw her physical deterioration as a personal affront, a failure of his own, and he pushed her harder, demanding more, even as she weakened under the strain. The cycle of cruelty, desperation, and failure seemed endless, and Maria Isabel, once full of life and hope, had been reduced to a shadow of her former self. In 1824, after nearly a decade of suffering, Maria Isabel succumbed to the psychological and physical toll of her marriage. Her death, officially attributed to nervous exhaustion, was the result of years of emotional and physical abuse at the hands of her husband. Ferdinand, once again, showed little emotion at her passing. He quickly sought out another bride, determined to continue his quest for an heir, never once pausing to consider the damage he had caused to the women who had borne the weight of his obsession. Maria Isabel's death was a tragic reflection of the dark legacy of Ferdinand's deformity. It was not just the failure to produce an heir that had destroyed her, it was the cruelty, the humiliation, and the relentless pressure placed upon her by a king who could not reconcile his body with his duty. Ferdinand's third marriage to Maria Joseph Amalia of Saxony in 1819 was yet another attempt to secure the heir that had so far eluded him. After the death of Maria Isabel, Ferdinand's desperation reached new heights. He had already lost two wives to the torment of his body's deformity, but he remained undeterred. The weight of his failure to produce a successor was unbearable, and his drive to restore his lineage was all-consuming. Maria Joseph Amalia, the 24-year-old Saxon princess, was unaware of the cruel fate that awaited her when she arrived in Spain. Like Maria Isabel before her, she was naive and hopeful, eager to fulfill her role as the future Queen of Spain and the mother of its heir. But like the others, she too would become a prisoner to Ferdinand's obsessive pursuit of an heir, a pursuit that would consume not only her body but her soul. Maria Joseph had been carefully briefed by her family before her marriage, and had heard the rumors of Ferdinand's strange condition. Her advisors had warned her about the king's deformity, but the full extent of it was something no one could truly prepare for. When she arrived in Madrid, she was introduced to a man who, at first glance, appeared to be the king, commanding, powerful, and regal. But beneath that exterior lay a man consumed by his own shame, a man whose insecurities had taken root in every aspect of his life. His deformity, which had once been a source of personal humiliation, had now become the center of his existence. The wedding night, like the others before it, was filled not with the romance that is expected of royal marriages, but with cold, clinical preparations. The specially designed cushions, the oils, and the strange devices that had been used with Maria Antonia and Maria Isabel were once again brought into play. Ferdinand's obsession with producing an heir had become an almost mechanical task, devoid of love or passion. Maria Joseph, who had been raised in a world where royal marriages were seen as a duty and a responsibility, quickly learned that this marriage was anything but a typical royal union. What followed was a ritual of humiliation and distress for both Ferdinand and Maria Joseph. The king, despite his outward appearance of authority, was terrified of failure. His obsession with producing an heir consumed him. He had become a man who saw his own body as the enemy, and his wives as tools for his own desperate need for validation. Maria Joseph, who had entered the marriage full of hope, quickly realized that her body was not her own, but part of a twisted process that had nothing to do with affection or intimacy. Each night became a test, a trial by fire in which she was forced to submit to the king's demands, no matter how unnatural or painful. Ferdinand, though aware of his deformity, could not accept it. He saw it as something that could be conquered, something that could be overcome with enough effort and perseverance. But this belief only deepened his cruelty. He pushed Maria Joseph harder than he had his previous wives, convinced that her reluctance was the root of their failure. In his mind, his body was not the problem, his wives were. The pressure to produce an heir was overwhelming, and Ferdinand's obsession with this goal became more intense with each passing day. Maria Joseph, already suffering from the physical toll of these nightly rituals, began to withdraw emotionally. Her once vibrant spirit, full of youthful hope and excitement, was slowly crushed under the weight of her husband's obsession. The king's increasing cruelty only deepened her sense of isolation. She became a mere vessel for Ferdinand's desire. To prove his manhood, his kingship, his legacy, she was not a queen, a wife, or even a woman. She was just another obstacle to be overcome in his quest for an heir. The psychological toll of Ferdinand's relentless pursuit of an heir became more evident as the months wore on. Maria Joseph, once confident and strong, began to show signs of severe distress. She became gaunt, her face drawn with the strain of the marital duties she was forced to endure. The weight of Ferdinand's demands, his constant accusations, and his refusal to see her as anything but a means to an end broke her spirit. She was no longer the young woman who had come to Spain with dreams of fulfilling her royal duty. She was a broken shell of a queen, trapped in a marriage that offered her no hope, no affection, and no future. The courtiers who had once admired her beauty and grace now saw only a woman consumed by despair. Ferdinand's obsession with his body, his sexual dysfunction, and his inability to fulfill his royal duties had infected every part of the Spanish court. Maria Joseph's suffering became the backdrop of the royal palace, a dark secret that no one dared speak of. The palace, once a symbol of Spain's glory and grandeur, had become a prison for those trapped in Ferdinand's web of despair. The medical staff that attended to Maria Joseph grew increasingly concerned with her health. They had seen the toll the king's obsession had taken on his previous wives, but they could not intervene. They were bound by their duty to the crown, and any attempt to challenge Ferdinand's authority would have been met with harsh consequences. The physicians, who had once believed they were serving the king's best interests, now found themselves complicit in the suffering of a woman they could not help. They had seen the damage done to Maria Isabel, but they had no power to prevent history from repeating itself. The king's body, with its grotesque deformity, had become a curse that was passed from wife to wife, each one suffering under the weight of Ferdinand's obsession. Maria Joseph's health continued to decline, and the strain of her marriage began to take its toll in ways that were impossible to ignore. The queen became more reclusive, her health deteriorating as she retreated into herself. Ferdinand, oblivious to the damage he had caused, saw her suffering not as a tragedy, but as another failure on his part. His obsession with producing an heir consumed him completely, leaving no room for compassion, empathy, or even basic human decency. To Ferdinand, his wife's suffering was just another obstacle to be overcome in his quest for an heir, an obstacle that could not be allowed to stand in the way of his legacy. In 1829, after years of emotional and physical torment, Maria Joseph succumbed to the toll her marriage had taken on her body. Her death, like that of his previous wives, was officially attributed to nervous exhaustion, but it was clear to anyone who had observed her that she had died from the strain of a marriage built on cruelty, obsession, and the relentless pursuit of an unattainable goal. Ferdinand, as he had with Maria Isabel and Maria Antonia, showed little emotion at her death. He quickly moved on, already seeking out a fourth wife to continue his quest for an heir. For Ferdinand, the cycle of desperation and cruelty would never end. He was a man consumed by his own body, his own failure, and the belief that he could somehow conquer his fate. In 1829, Ferdinand's quest for an heir took an unexpected turn when he married Maria Cristina of Naples, a woman who would become the final victim of his obsessive pursuit of succession. By this point, Ferdinand had become a man entirely defined by his deformity, his failure to produce an heir, and his increasingly paranoid belief that his legacy could only be secured by a male child. Maria Cristina, 23 years old when she arrived in Madrid, was unaware of the full scope of Ferdinand's strange condition or the horrors that awaited her. Her marriage to the king was not one based on mutual affection, but one dictated by the political pressures of the Spanish court. However, Maria Cristina was already pregnant with another man's child when she arrived in Madrid, a fact that would remain a closely guarded secret for as long as Ferdinand lived. Maria Cristina's marriage to Ferdinand was marked by an air of tension from the beginning. The wedding ceremony, though grand and full of the pomp that befitted a royal union, was underscored by the knowledge that Ferdinand's desperation had reached its peak. His previous 3 marriages had failed to produce a legitimate heir, and now, at the age of 45, Ferdinand's obsession with producing a son had reached a fever pitch. He had already suffered the emotional and physical loss of 3 wives, each of whom had succumbed to the psychological and physical strain of their marriage. Now, his eyes were set on Maria Cristina, whose youth and apparent health seemed like the last hope for securing the throne. But Maria Cristina, as it turned out, was hiding a secret. She had already conceived a child, one that was not Ferdinand's. Her pregnancy, which had begun before she arrived in Spain, was a source of great anxiety for her. She knew that the king would never accept a child that wasn't his own, and so she was forced to play the part of a dutiful wife, hiding the truth of her condition. She pretended that Ferdinand had finally succeeded in his quest for an heir, while secretly knowing that the child she carried was the result of an affair with a man she had known before her marriage to the king. For Ferdinand, this deception was both a bitter irony and a desperate hope. He had spent his entire life searching for a son, believing that only by securing a legitimate heir would he ever be remembered as a king of consequence. Yet, as he married Maria Cristina, the very thing he desired most, an heir, was not his to claim. He had, in a sense, already lost before the marriage had even begun. His desperation, however, clouded his judgment, and he chose to believe that this marriage might finally bring him the heir he so desperately needed, even though the reality was far different. Maria Cristina, caught in the delicate dance of royal obligation and personal deception, found herself trapped in a marriage she had little control over. She had been raised in the rigid world of royal diplomacy, where personal desires were secondary to political necessity. Her marriage to Ferdinand, like all the others before her, was a transaction. But unlike his previous wives, Maria Cristina harbored her own secrets that would change the course of Spain's history. The wedding night, though nothing compared to the horrors of his previous marriages, was still marked by Ferdinand's obsessive need for control. As before, he insisted on the strange medical preparations that had defined his earlier unions. The cushions, the oils, the humiliating rituals, all of it played out once again, with Ferdinand convinced that his marriage would finally fulfill his royal duty. The fact that Maria Cristina was already pregnant did little to deter him. He still believed that she could bear him an heir, despite the fact that the child she carried was not his own. Ferdinand's obsession with his deformity, his failure to produce a legitimate heir, and his paranoia about what the court might think, all combined to create a nightmarish atmosphere in which Maria Cristina was forced to play a role she did not want. The pressure on her grew with each passing day. Ferdinand, convinced that the child in Maria Cristina's womb was somehow the key to his legacy, became fixated on her every move. He demanded that she undergo constant medical examinations, ensuring that she was in the best possible condition to give birth to his heir. The royal physicians, once again bound by duty, were forced to comply with Ferdinand's increasingly absurd demands. The situation was absurd. The king was obsessed with a child that he could not claim as his own but to him. The appearance of legitimacy was all that mattered. Maria Cristina, already carrying a child that was not Ferdinand's, was now forced to pretend that this was the moment when everything would fall into place, when the king's legacy would be secured. The political ramifications of this charade were not lost on Ferdinand. His paranoia continued to deepen as the weeks wore on. He could not trust anyone, not even his wife, and he began to see plots and conspiracies in every corner of the court. The very air around him seemed to pulse with suspicion, as if every glance, every conversation, was part of a grand conspiracy to undermine his rule. He was determined to make sure that his new wife's pregnancy went according to plan. But the more he forced the issue, the more strained their relationship became. Maria Cristina, caught between her own personal shame and the political demands of her marriage, began to deteriorate under the pressure. She knew that Ferdinand could never accept the truth that the child she carried was not his yet. She also knew that the survival of the Spanish monarchy depended on keeping up the ruse. She had no choice but to comply with Ferdinand's increasing demands, as painful and humiliating as they were. The tension between them grew with each passing day, until Ferdinand's paranoia reached a fever pitch. He began to believe that others, including his wife, were conspiring to keep the truth from him. Despite the deception, the birth of the child in 1830 brought Ferdinand a fleeting moment of joy. A daughter was born, and Ferdinand, desperate for any sign of legitimacy, chose to believe that she was his heir. He was forced to pretend that Maria Christina's child was indeed the future king, though every part of him knew the truth. The irony of it all was not lost on him. He had spent his entire life obsessed with producing a male heir, but now, in his final years, he was confronted with the truth that his legacy would not be carried on by a son but by a daughter. Ferdinand's obsession with paternity, with the question of his legacy, would haunt him until his death. The birth of Isabella II was not the triumphant moment Ferdinand had hoped for. It was a bittersweet reminder of all the failures that had preceded it. The king, unable to accept the reality of his situation, clung to the fantasy of an heir. Even as the monarchy crumbled around him as Ferdinand aged, the signs of his mental deterioration became impossible to ignore. The weight of his failures, the failed marriages, the lost heirs, the public humiliation had taken their toll. His mind, once sharp and focused on the task of securing Spain's throne, was now clouded with delusions, insecurities, and a relentless need to control every aspect of his world. His obsession with his deformity, which had defined much of his adult life, now became the focal point of his paranoia. It was no longer just his body that tormented him. It was the constant, ever-present fear that his royal position was in jeopardy, that those around him, his courtiers, his family, even his advisors, were conspiring to undermine his rule. Spain itself, once a global empire, was crumbling around Ferdinand. The colonies in the Americas were rebelling, seeking independence from the Spanish crown. The once proud empire, with its vast territories stretching across continents, was disintegrating before his eyes. Ferdinand, however, remained focused not on the fate of his kingdom, but on his own personal demons. He could not accept that his body, his mind, and his reign were beyond repair. The more he tried to assert control over Spain's fading empire, the more the kingdom slipped away. And as the nation faltered, Ferdinand's paranoia only deepened, becoming a driving force in the final years of his reign. His court, once the epitome of royal elegance and sophistication, had become a hotbed of fear and suspicion. Ferdinand's once loyal advisors, those who had served him throughout his reign, now found themselves caught in a web of lies and deceit. His increasing mental instability led to erratic decisions and purges, where those who fell out of favor were dismissed, exiled, or worse. Ferdinand's increasing mistrust of those around him led to a climate of terror within the palace walls. There were whispers of spies everywhere, and anyone who was suspected of disloyalty faced swift retribution. His advisors, once his trusted confidants, were now forced to walk on eggshells, fearful of saying or doing anything that might provoke the king's wrath. Ferdinand's paranoia was not just confined to his court, it extended to his own family. He became increasingly suspicious of his wife, Maria Christina, and their daughter, Isabella II, despite the fact that Isabella was his heir. Ferdinand could not escape the feeling that she was not truly his child, that somehow she was a product of a conspiracy. He would spend hours examining her features, comparing them to his own, convinced that she bore no resemblance to him. His obsession with her legitimacy consumed him, and he began to see betrayal everywhere. His relationship with Maria Cristina became increasingly strained as his mistrust of her grew. He believed that she was conspiring against him, hiding secrets from him, and possibly even plotting to install Isabella as a puppet ruler. The paranoia that had once been confined to his royal duties now infected every aspect of his personal life. Ferdinand would burst into his wife's chambers at all hours of the night, convinced that she was hiding something from him. His spies were everywhere, listening at doors, watching the courtiers, and reporting back to him on any perceived sign of disloyalty. Ferdinand's obsession with control reached absurd levels. He ordered the construction of secret passageways throughout the palace so that he could move unseen between his chambers and his wife's. He insisted on constant surveillance of everyone around him, convinced that plots were afoot, that enemies were everywhere, even in the most trusted corners of his court. The result of this paranoia was a breakdown of the royal household. The servants, once loyal and content in their roles, now lived in fear. Ferdinand's outbursts were unpredictable, and his cruelty became more apparent as he lashed out at those who displeased him. He began to distrust even his closest family members. His brother, Don Carlos, who had once been a loyal ally, found himself the target of Ferdinand's growing suspicions. Ferdinand would make strange contradictory statements in private, just to see if anyone would correct him. If they did, he interpreted it as a sign of disloyalty and accused them of conspiring against him. The royal court had devolved into a place of constant surveillance, where no one was safe from the king's wrath. Ferdinand's mental state continued to deteriorate as the years wore on. His once imposing physical presence began to fade as his health declined. His insomnia grew worse, and his constant anxiety affected his digestion. He became gaunt, pale and hollow-eyed, a man consumed not only by his physical deformity but by his own mind. The psychological toll of his reign, marked by cruelty, betrayal, and unrelenting fear, had worn him down. He had spent so many years battling his own body, his own insecurities, and his own demons, that he had lost sight of the world around him. His obsession with his legacy and his need to control everything had consumed him entirely. The political and social unrest outside the palace walls only added to his sense of isolation. Spain's colonies in the Americas had rebelled, and the once mighty empire was in a state of disintegration. Ferdinand, however, seemed indifferent to the fate of his kingdom. His obsession with his personal legacy, with proving his manhood and securing a legitimate heir, had left him blind to the larger picture. While Spain's empire crumbled, Ferdinand focused on the minutiae of court life, the comings and goings of courtiers, the movements of his family, the legitimacy of his daughter. Ferdinand's reign had been marked by personal failure and political instability, and in his final years he was a shadow of the king he once hoped to be. The fear and cruelty that had defined his rule had created a legacy of suffering for his wives, then for his courtiers, and finally for the people of Spain. Ferdinand had once been a symbol of royal power, but by the end of his life, he had become a symbol of the dangers of unchecked authority and the destructive power of personal obsession. Ferdinand's final years were marked by a deepening depression. He had lost his grip on both his mind and his kingdom. His obsession with producing a legitimate heir had turned him into a man of misery, and the weight of his failures had become too much to bear. He retreated further into his paranoia, avoiding contact with anyone who might remind him of the shattered state of his rule. The king, who had once commanded armies and ruled an empire, was now a broken man, consumed by fear and regret. When Ferdinand died in 1833, the official cause of death was listed as gout, but those who knew him understood that he had died from the exhaustion of a life spent battling his own body, his own mind, and the crumbling kingdom he had failed to protect. His death marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter for Spain, one that would be defined not by Ferdinand, but by his daughter, Isabella II, whose legitimacy would forever be tainted by the lies and deceptions that had defined her father's reign. Ferdinand's final years were a stark contrast to the once mighty king he had been. In his youth, he had exuded royal authority, commanding armies and ruling over vast territories. But by the time he entered his final days, he had become a broken man, his health failing, his mind fractured by years of paranoia, cruelty, and failure. The weight of his deformity, which had shaped his entire life, had finally worn him down, and the kingdom he had tried so desperately to preserve was unraveling. Around him, Ferdinand's physical decline had been gradual but inevitable. His once imposing figure had become gaunt, his skin pale and thin, his movements slow and labored. His insomnia, which had plagued him for years, worsened. He could no longer sleep, his mind constantly racing with thoughts of betrayal and conspiracy. His once sharp mind was now clouded, and he struggled to make coherent decisions. His digestion was ruined, and he could barely eat, his body too weak to process even the simplest of meals. The stress of his reign, the psychological toll of his deformity, and the years of internal strife had finally taken their toll on his body. He had become a shell of the king he once was, a man consumed by his own anxieties and regrets. As his health deteriorated, Ferdinand withdrew further from the public eye. He became more reclusive, refusing to meet with ministers, advisors, or even family members. His once bright eyes, filled with the fire of royal ambition, were now dull and lifeless. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were incoherent, mired in a web of delusions and paranoia. The king who had once been the center of Spain's political power was now a frail old man, isolated in his palace, a prisoner of his own mind. Despite his declining health, Ferdinand's obsession with his legacy remained. His thoughts were still consumed by the need to secure an heir, and in his final days, he clung to the hope that his daughter, Isabella II, would continue his dynasty. But deep down, he knew the truth that his bloodline had been tainted by generations of inbreeding, and that his legacy was built on a foundation of lies. The last months of his life were spent in agonizing uncertainty, as he grappled with the reality that the empire he had tried so desperately to hold together was slipping away. The American colonies had already declared their independence, and Spain's empire, once the envy of Europe, was crumbling. In his final weeks, Ferdinand's paranoia reached new heights. He saw conspiracies everywhere, even in the most innocent of actions. His daughter, Isabella, was the subject of his intense scrutiny. He questioned her legitimacy, convinced that she was not truly his heir, despite the fact that she was his only surviving child. He had long since lost trust in his wife, Maria Cristina, whom he now saw as a source of betrayal. He believed that she had conspired against him, and that she was secretly planning to install Isabella as a puppet queen. His mental state had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer distinguish between reality and his delusions. The royal court, once a place of opulence and grandeur, had become a place of fear and suspicion. Ferdinand's paranoia infected everyone around him. Courtiers and ministers were forced to constantly look over their shoulders, afraid that they might incur the king's wrath. Even his closest allies were not safe from his accusations. Ferdinand would summon them to his chambers for late-night interrogations, questioning their loyalty and demanding assurances that they were not plotting against him. No one was exempt from his suspicions, and his reign became defined by this constant atmosphere of fear. Ferdinand's ministers, who had once served him with respect, now found themselves in a difficult position. The kingdom was on the verge of collapse, yet the king's mental state was so fragile that they dared not challenge his decisions. The Spanish monarchy, once the pinnacle of European power, had become a symbol of instability and dysfunction. Ferdinand's rule had been marked by cruelty, paranoia, and personal failure, and as his health deteriorated, it became clear that the future of Spain would not rest in his hands, but in the hands of his daughter, Isabella. Despite the turmoil surrounding him, Ferdinand clung to the hope that his death would be the end of the madness, and that Isabella would carry on his legacy. But even in death, Ferdinand's legacy was marked by the shame of his deformity and the destruction he had wrought upon the monarchy. He had spent his life battling against his own body, his own insecurities, and the failing empire he had inherited. And in the end, he had left behind a broken kingdom, one that would be forced to contend with the consequences of his reign for generations to come. Ferdinand's death, when it finally came in 1833, was a quiet affair. The official cause of death was listed as gout, but those who had witnessed his decline knew that his true cause of death was far more complex. It was the culmination of a lifetime spent battling personal demons: his deformity, his paranoia, his inability to connect with those around him. He had been consumed by his own failures, and in the end, it had destroyed him. It had destroyed him. Ferdinand's death marked the end of an era in Spain. His reign, though long, had been defined by failure and dysfunction, and the country he left behind was a shadow of its former self. The American colonies, once the pride of the Spanish Empire, had already gained independence, and Spain's European holdings were in disarray. The monarchy, once an all-powerful institution, was now teetering on the edge of collapse. Isabella II, his only surviving child, was crowned queen at the age of 3, and the country now looked to her to restore the monarchy to its former glory. But the legacy of Ferdinand's reign would haunt her, as she inherited a kingdom that had been ravaged by decades of misrule, internal strife, and personal failure. Spain, like Ferdinand, had been consumed by its own insecurities, and it would take generations to rebuild what had been lost. Ferdinand's reign is remembered not for his accomplishments or the grandeur of his court, but for the personal tragedy that defined it. His deformity, his paranoia, and his inability to produce an heir were the driving forces behind his rule, and in the end, they led to his downfall. Ferdinand's legacy is one of power lost to personal failure, of a king who was consumed by his own body and mind, and of a kingdom that was left in ruins as a result. Ferdinand II's reign ended with a whimper, not a bang. His death in 1833, though not unexpected given his deteriorating health and mental state, marked the end of an era. The man who had once ruled Spain with such absolute authority, whose reign was defined by his obsession with his deformity and the need to prove his masculinity, left behind a fractured kingdom. Spain's imperial glory had waned under his rule. The American colonies lost one by one, and the royal family left in shambles, tarnished by the twisted legacy he left in his wake. Ferdinand was not remembered as a great king, nor as a reformer of his nation. His reign, though long, had been marred by his personal failures, his inability to fulfill the most basic of royal duties, and his deep psychological trauma. The kingdom that he had inherited had become a shadow of its former self, and his attempts to maintain a semblance of authority only hastened its decline. His obsession with securing a legitimate heir, his cruelty toward his wives, and his growing paranoia left Spain struggling to move forward. Its political and economic systems weakened under the strain of his instability. In the years following Ferdinand's death, his legacy was one of dysfunction. The throne passed to his daughter, Isabella II, who was only 3 years old at the time. Spain, unable to fully recover from the devastation wrought by her father's reign, found itself embroiled in civil war and political upheaval. The Carlist Wars, a series of conflicts over the legitimacy of Isabella's rule, erupted almost immediately after Ferdinand's passing. The war, which would drag on for decades, was a reflection of the fractured nation that Ferdinand had left behind. The monarchy, once the symbol of Spain's power and unity, had become a source of division, a tool of political factionalism. Ferdinand's personal legacy, marked by his deformity, his paranoia, and his cruel treatment of his wives, would be obscured by history, but it would not be forgotten. His reign would be seen as a warning, a lesson in the dangers of unchecked authority, of personal failure, and of the catastrophic effects of living in denial. Ferdinand's story was one of a man who could not reconcile his own limitations, both physical and psychological, with the demands placed upon him by the throne. In his obsession to maintain his royal bloodline, he lost sight of the larger picture that his own kingdom, his own people, were more important than his own personal struggles. It was clear that Ferdinand's deformity, which had haunted him throughout his life, had ultimately become his undoing. While many kings throughout history have been defined by their accomplishments, their political acumen, or their military victories, Ferdinand II was defined by his failure, by his inability to overcome the personal obstacles that had been imposed on him by nature. His body, grotesque and unnatural, became a symbol not of power but of weakness. It was a constant reminder of his inability to achieve the one thing that every monarch is expected to do: to produce an heir, a legitimate successor to the throne. The cruelty he inflicted on his wives, the women who were supposed to help him secure his legacy, became a dark chapter in Spain's history. Maria Antonia, Maria Isabel, and Maria Joseph Amelie, of them, in their own way, was a victim of Ferdinand's obsession. Their suffering, physical and emotional, was a direct result of his inability to confront his own body and accept his condition. They were not just his wives. They were tools in his desperate, fruitless pursuit of an heir. Their fates, tragically, became intertwined with his, and they suffered as a result of the psychological scars that Ferdinand carried with him throughout his life. Ferdinand's paranoia, which had reached its peak in his later years, left an indelible mark on Spain's royal court. The atmosphere of fear that surrounded the monarchy, the endless intrigue and suspicion, was a direct result of his erratic behavior. His suspicion of those closest to him, his family, his advisors, and even his servants created a court where loyalty was a fragile thing, and betrayal lurked behind every corner. Ferdinand's increasing distrust of everyone around him not only undermined the unity of the monarchy, but also sowed the seeds of political instability that would plague Spain for decades after his death. The failure to produce a male heir became the defining tragedy of Ferdinand's reign, and it would shape the future of Spain's monarchy. Though Isabella II was crowned queen, her legitimacy was always questioned, given the circumstances of her birth and the political machinations that surrounded her succession. Her reign, though long, was marred by scandal, division, and revolution, and her ascension to the throne was seen by many as a direct consequence of Ferdinand's own inability to secure the throne through his own bloodline. Ferdinand's legacy, then, is a complex and painful one, a reminder of how personal dysfunction can bleed into public life, how the failures of a single individual can have far-reaching consequences for an entire nation. His reign serves as a cautionary tale for future monarchs, a warning that personal failure, when combined with absolute power, can lead to a nation's downfall. The king who sought to control everything around him ended up losing control of the very kingdom he had worked so hard to maintain. In the end, Ferdinand II was not remembered as a great king, nor as a ruler who brought glory to Spain. He was remembered as a man who, despite all his power, was ultimately defeated by his own insecurities. His deformity, once seen as a source of royal shame, had become the symbol of a reign defined by failure and cruelty. The kingdom he left behind was broken and divided, a victim of his obsessions and his inability to accept his own limitations. The story of Ferdinand II is one of power lost to personal flaws, of a monarch who could not transcend his own body and mind. He spent his entire life trying to prove his worth, but in the end, it was his inability to confront his most intimate weaknesses that destroyed him. His death, though marking the end of his reign, was not the end of his legacy. His personal struggles, his paranoia, and his failures would haunt Spain for generations to come. When Ferdinand II died in 1833, Spain was a nation on the brink of collapse. His passing, though marking the end of a tyrannical and deeply troubled reign, did little to stabilize the kingdom. His death left a power vacuum, one that would be filled not by an experienced leader, but by a child, his only surviving heir, Isabella II. At just 3 years old, Isabella was far from prepared to rule, and her reign, beginning under the shadow of her father's failures, was marked by controversy and conflict from the very start. Ferdinand's death did not just signal the end of his life, but the culmination of decades of misrule that had weakened the Spanish monarchy and strained the nation's social, political, and economic structures. Spain, once a global empire, had lost its most valuable colonies in the Americas, and the remnants of its empire were being undermined by revolution and independence movements. The Spanish crown was no longer the force it once was. Instead, it was a fractured and weakened institution struggling to maintain control over a kingdom in turmoil. In the wake of Ferdinand's death, Spain was plunged into a series of political crises. The Carlist Wars, a conflict between supporters of Ferdinand's daughter Isabella and those who backed his brother, Don Carlos, erupted almost immediately after his passing. The civil war that followed would ravage the country for decades as rival factions fought for control of the throne. The Carlists, who saw Don Carlos as the rightful heir to the throne, rejected Isabella's legitimacy, believing that she was not truly Ferdinand's daughter, given the controversies surrounding her birth. To them, the idea of a female monarch was anathema, and they fought for the restoration of what they saw as the rightful male heir. The Carlist Wars were not just a battle for the throne, they were also a clash of ideologies. The Carlists, supported by conservative factions, wanted to maintain Spain's traditionalist, absolutist monarchy, while Isabella's supporters, including liberal reformers, sought a more constitutional monarchy that would grant greater rights to the people. The war divided Spain, with different regions of the country siding with either the Carlists or Isabella's supporters. For years, Spain was embroiled in conflict, and the monarchy's legitimacy remained in question. But even before the Carlist Wars began, the damage done by Ferdinand's reign was already apparent. The Spanish court, long a symbol of wealth and sophistication, had become a place of distrust and fear. Ferdinand's cruelty and paranoia had left deep scars, and the courtiers who served him were left with a legacy of suspicion and division. Ferdinand's reign had not just been a personal tragedy for him, it had been a tragedy for Spain itself. The royal family was now seen as fractured and incapable of leading the country forward. The psychological toll of Ferdinand's rule could be seen in the way that the new queen, Isabella II, was forced to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics. As a young child, she was ill-equipped to deal with the challenges of ruling a nation in crisis. The power struggles between her regents, who fought for control over her, only made things worse. Isabella was constantly surrounded by men who sought to manipulate her for their own ends, and she struggled to assert her authority in a court that was full of scheming and intrigue. Her reign was marked by political instability, corruption, and the constant threat of rebellion, as various factions within Spain fought for control of the throne. But the legacy of Ferdinand II's reign did not just affect the monarchy. Spain's entire social and political system was in disarray. The Spanish Empire, which had once been the most powerful in Europe, had been reduced to a mere shadow of its former self. Spain's colonies in the Americas had gained independence, and the once proud Spanish navy was in decline. The economy was in shambles, and the country faced widespread poverty and unrest. Ferdinand's obsession with his own body, his failure to confront his personal demons, and his inability to produce a legitimate heir had left Spain in a state of disarray. Ferdinand's personal failures were now intertwined with Spain's national failures. The political instability that followed his death was a direct result of his inability to secure an heir, and his failure to provide the kingdom with the leadership it so desperately needed. The monarchy was no longer a symbol of power and unity. It had become a source of division and conflict. The struggles of Ferdinand's reign had infected every aspect of Spanish society, from the highest courts to the poorest villages. Isabella II, though eventually crowned queen, never fully escaped the shadow of her father's reign. She was the product of Ferdinand's desperation, and her legitimacy was constantly questioned. The political struggles and rebellions that marked her reign were in part the result of the uncertainty surrounding her father's legacy. While Ferdinand may have hoped that his daughter would be the key to securing Spain's future, the reality was that she inherited a kingdom fractured by his mistakes. The royal family, once the epitome of power, was now seen by many as a symbol of Spain's decline. The impact of Ferdinand's reign could also be seen in the broader social and political changes that began to take place in Spain during the 19th century. The country was torn between competing visions of its future. Some wanted to restore the old absolutist monarchy, while others sought to implement liberal reforms and move toward a constitutional monarchy. The struggle for control over the throne and the direction of the country was reflected in the ongoing political conflict, which would ultimately lead to the Spanish Revolution of 1868 and the eventual establishment of a constitutional monarchy. Ferdinand's legacy was one of personal tragedy, political failure, and national decline. His reign had been defined by his obsession with producing a legitimate heir, and in the end, his failure to do so had brought Spain to the brink of collapse. The monarchy he had worked so hard to protect was now seen as an institution in crisis, and his personal flaws became the driving force behind Spain's political instability. Spain's descent into chaos after Ferdinand's death was not just a consequence of his rule, but a reflection of the deep-seated issues that plagued the monarchy and the nation as a whole. The failure of the Spanish Empire, the loss of its colonies, and the rise of political factions all pointed to the unraveling of the Spanish crown. Ferdinand's legacy, though filled with personal shame and failure, would go on to define the future of Spain. As the monarchy continued to struggle with questions of legitimacy, power, and reform, Ferdinand II's reign was defined by failure to produce a legitimate male heir, the failure to protect Spain's imperial power, and, ultimately, the failure to preserve the integrity of his bloodline. His death, while ending a tyrannical chapter, left behind a royal legacy tarnished by dysfunction and scandal. The most immediate consequence of his passing was the ascension of his only surviving child, Isabella II, to the throne of Spain, but her reign would be burdened with the indelible marks of her father's legacy. The dynastic issues, which Ferdinand had struggled with throughout his life, would not only haunt him but would plague his daughter and the very institution of the Spanish monarchy for years to come. Isabella's ascension to the throne at the age of 3 was a desperate moment for a kingdom, already weakened by political instability, economic struggles, and the decay of imperial power. Spain, once one of the most powerful nations in Europe, was now in a state of disarray, and the monarchy was no longer a symbol of unity but a point of contention. Ferdinand's failure to produce a legitimate male heir had set the stage for Isabella's controversial reign, and the legitimacy of her rule was immediately questioned. Her ascension to the throne ignited the Carlist Wars, which would split Spain into rival factions and send the country into civil conflict. The Carlists, loyal to Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, saw Isabella as an illegitimate queen. To them, the Spanish throne should have passed to Don Carlos, who had a stronger claim through his male lineage. They rejected the idea of a female monarch, and the legitimacy of Isabella's rule was immediately put into question. This conflict over the throne would divide Spain for decades, leading to a bloody and protracted civil war. The Carlist Wars became more than just a fight for the throne. They were a battle over Spain's future between conservatives who sought to preserve traditional, absolutist rule, and liberals who called for constitutional reforms and greater rights for the people. Isabella, though crowned queen, would always struggle with the stain of illegitimacy placed on her from birth. Her father's failure to secure an heir through his own bloodline had led to her succession, but her own legitimacy was constantly under attack. The nation's divided factions, each with their own vision of Spain's future, saw her as a weak and symbolic figurehead. Even those loyal to her crown could not escape the shadow of Ferdinand's reign. His obsession with securing an heir, his mistreatment of his wives, and the cruel nature of his rule had left behind a legacy that Spain's royal family could not shake. Though Isabella II would go on to rule for several decades, her reign was marred by scandal, political intrigue, and the constant struggle to maintain control of the throne. The nation's internal strife, caused by the competing factions of the Carlists and liberals, made it impossible for her to rule with any stability. Her government was frequently overthrown, and she was forced into exile twice, once in 1868, after a revolution against her regime, and later after the final collapse of the monarchy in 1931. She was also surrounded by corruption, including the infamous sale of public offices, which damaged her credibility and alienated her from the people. The very monarchy that Ferdinand II had hoped to preserve was now under siege, and his daughter was left to grapple with the consequences of her father's failures. Ferdinand's bloodline, already weakened by inbreeding, now found itself embroiled. In personal and political turmoil, his daughters, Isabella and her sister, had both been products of royal intermarriage, a system that Ferdinand's own ancestors had employed to keep power within the family. But this genetic legacy came with devastating consequences. Ferdinand had been the product of a long line of inbreeding within the Spanish Habsburg and Bourbon families, and his deformity was a tragic manifestation of the genetic cost of such practices. This inheritance of flawed genes would be passed down to his daughters, who would both struggle with their own personal health issues, further complicating Spain's dynastic future. Isabella's reign was also marked by her inability to produce a male heir of her own. Despite marrying several times, Isabella's marriages did not yield the desired results. She gave birth to several children, but many of them died young, and the question of who would succeed her remained unresolved for much of her reign. The Spanish throne, already weakened by Ferdinand's failure to provide an heir, now found itself in a precarious position. Isabella's struggles to secure the future of the monarchy were compounded by the political instability that characterized much of her reign. The political factions that had once supported Isabella now began to fracture. The Carlist Wars, which had raged for decades, left the nation politically divided, with different groups vying for power. The liberals, who had once supported Isabella's claim to the throne, began to turn on her as she failed to live up to their expectations. The country's growing disillusionment with the monarchy was compounded by the growing influence of republicanism, which advocated for the abolition of the monarchy altogether. In 1868, a revolution forced Isabella into exile, and her reign came to an end. Though Isabella would return to Spain in 1874, she was unable to restore the monarchy to its former glory. Her reign had been marked by division and scandal, and she was unable to win back the trust of the Spanish people. The monarchy that Ferdinand II had sought to preserve had become a fractured and divided institution, incapable of maintaining the unity and stability that had once defined it. Ferdinand's bloodline, though it had lasted for generations, was now seen as a symbol of Spain's decline, a reminder of the destructive power of personal dysfunction, political instability, and dynastic failure. Isabella's eventual abdication in 1870 and the fall of the monarchy in the early 20th century marked the final chapter of Ferdinand II's legacy. His failure to produce a legitimate heir, his cruelty toward his wives, and his obsessive pursuit of an heir had left Spain in a state of political turmoil that lasted long after his death. Spain, once a dominant power, was now a country in transition, torn between monarchist factions and rising republicanism, a nation struggling to reconcile its past with its uncertain future. Ferdinand II's legacy serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of absolute power, personal obsession, and the consequences of ignoring the needs of a nation in favor of personal fulfillment. His reign, defined by failure, cruelty, and paranoia, left behind a fractured kingdom that would spend the next century trying to recover from the wounds he inflicted upon it. His death did not mark the end of his influence, but the beginning of a long and painful struggle for Spain's monarchy and its future. Ferdinand II's death in 1833 did not mark the end of his influence over Spain. His reign, defined by personal failure, paranoia, and political turmoil, left deep scars that would take generations to heal. His obsession with securing an heir, his treatment of his wives, and his inability to reconcile his own body with the demands of the throne led to a fragile and fractured monarchy that would never recover in the years following his death. Spain was drawn into a series of conflicts, revolutions, and political shifts. each one a consequence of the royal family's dysfunction and the decay of the once proud Spanish Empire. The Carlist Wars, which erupted immediately after Ferdinand's passing, were just the beginning of Spain's struggles. The wars were fought between two rival factions, the supporters of Isabella II, the daughter Ferdinand had left behind, and the supporters of her uncle, Don Carlos, who believed that the throne should have passed to him instead of a woman. The conflict was not only about the succession to the throne, it was a battle for the future of Spain itself. The Carlists, who believed in a more traditional, absolutist monarchy, were in direct opposition to Isabella's supporters, who sought a more liberal and constitutional monarchy. The result was a brutal and protracted civil war that left the country divided, politically and ideologically. The wars raged on for years, with the Carlists being pushed to the fringes but never fully defeated. Isabella II, though crowned queen, could never enjoy the stability and support that her predecessors had. Her reign was marred by political infighting, corruption, and widespread dissatisfaction. The monarchy, once seen as a symbol of Spain's glory, had become a point of contention, dividing the nation and causing irreparable harm to its social and political fabric. Even though Isabella was eventually crowned and held power for several decades, her reign was plagued by scandal, corruption, and repeated attempts to overthrow her. She struggled with the weight of her father's legacy. The spectre of his failure to produce a legitimate heir loomed over her. The Carlist Wars had already demonstrated that the monarchy could no longer unite Spain. Isabella's legitimacy, always in question, further eroded her ability to rule effectively. Her personal life, including her marriages and the inability to provide a secure heir, was a constant source of public scrutiny. As she tried to solidify her reign, the monarchy's reputation was increasingly tied to corruption, ineptitude, and division. The monarchy, weakened by internal strife, political fragmentation, and the growing republican sentiment, began to lose the support of the Spanish people. The country's colonies, once the jewel of the empire, had already rebelled, and Spain's influence on the global stage continued to fade. The monarchy's inability to adapt to the changing political and social landscape made it seem increasingly outdated, a relic of a bygone era. By the time of the Spanish Revolution of 1868, Isabella's reign had become untenable, and she was forced into exile. Her departure marked the beginning of the end for the Spanish monarchy. Though Isabella would return to Spain in 1874, her reign would never fully recover. The monarchy, which had been built on centuries of absolute power, was now fractured. Spain's declining empire, coupled with rising republicanism, made it clear that the monarchy no longer represented the unity and strength it once had. In 1870, Isabella II was forced to abdicate, and Spain moved toward a more constitutional form of government. The monarchy, which had once been the bedrock of Spanish identity, was now seen as a fragile and contested institution. The political instability that followed Ferdinand's death only deepened in the 20th century. The Spanish throne continued to be a source of division, and the monarchy was unable to adapt to the changing tides of European and global politics. The Spanish people, weary of royal misrule and corruption, began to question the legitimacy of the monarchy itself. Republics and constitutional monarchies had already taken hold in other parts of Europe, and Spain's monarchy seemed increasingly out of touch with the modern world. Ferdinand's failure to produce a legitimate heir and the dynastic struggles that followed had set Spain on a path toward revolution. The monarchy, once a symbol of stability and national pride, was now a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in Spain. Dynastic failure, political division, and the slow collapse of The Empire. In 1931, after years of political turmoil and rising opposition to the monarchy, Spain officially abolished the monarchy and declared itself a republic. The reign of the Spanish Bourbons, which had begun with Ferdinand's ancestors, ended in a dramatic reversal of fortune. Ferdinand's legacy was, in the end, not one of dynastic triumph or imperial glory. His failure to secure the future of the Spanish monarchy had left the country in turmoil. The once proud kingdom that had ruled vast territories around the world was now reduced to a fragmented nation, struggling to find its place in the modern world. The monarchy, like Ferdinand himself, had become a symbol of dysfunction, a reminder of the dangers of absolute power and the consequences of personal obsession. In the wake of the monarchy's collapse, Spain faced a long and difficult road to recovery. The rise of fascism, civil war, and dictatorship would plague the country throughout much of the 20th century. The wounds caused by Ferdinand's reign would not heal easily, and Spain's political instability would continue to reverberate for decades. Ferdinand's death, though it brought an end to his reign, did not mark the end of the damage caused by his obsessive pursuit of an heir. His failure to produce a legitimate successor and the dynastic chaos that followed left Spain with a legacy of division, conflict, and political instability. The monarchy, once the most powerful institution in Spain, was now a symbol of national decline. Ferdinand II's personal struggles, his paranoia, and his refusal to accept the limitations of his own body and mind had brought about the downfall of one of Europe's greatest empires. Ferdinand II of Spain, though long dead, left an indelible mark on the history of Spain and the monarchy that bore his name. His reign, filled with personal tragedy, paranoid delusions, and catastrophic decisions, ultimately led to the disintegration of a once powerful empire and the demise of the Spanish monarchy as a ruling institution. In the years following his death in 1833, Spain, under the failed dynastic legacy that Ferdinand left behind, would experience decades of political instability, war, and revolution. The monarchy, tarnished by his mistakes, would struggle to hold on to any semblance of legitimacy. His bloodline, which he had so desperately tried to preserve, would become a symbol of national decline, not a beacon of hope for Spain's future. Spain's slow and painful slide into political and social instability had its roots in Ferdinand's reign. His obsession with producing a male heir, which consumed not only his life but the lives of his wives, turned the royal family into a tragic circus of dysfunction. This dysfunction was never fully addressed, and the consequences of his failure rippled through generations of Spanish rulers, each one struggling to overcome the weight of Ferdinand's inability to secure the throne and protect Spain from its own internal divisions. Ferdinand's legacy was compounded by the political turmoil that followed his death. Isabella II, his only surviving child, inherited the throne at the tender age of 3. But her ascension was not one of celebration, it was one of controversy. Isabella's legitimacy was immediately questioned, particularly by the Carlists, who claimed that her uncle, Don Carlos, should have been the rightful heir. This dynastic struggle ignited the Carlist Wars, which would ravage Spain for nearly a century. The wars fought between conservative forces loyal to Don Carlos and liberal factions supporting Isabella tore the country apart, setting the stage for even more political chaos in the years to come. Despite her eventual coronation, Isabella's reign was never secure. Her father's legacy, steeped in scandal and failure, loomed over her, casting doubt on her legitimacy as a ruler. The tensions that have been brewing during Ferdinand's lifetime came to a head during Isabella's reign. leading to repeated political instability, corruption, and military uprisings. The monarchy, which had once been a symbol of Spain's power, was now seen as a weak, fractured institution, incapable of leading the country in an age of revolution and reform. Isabella's failure to secure a stable royal line only deepened the monarchy's crisis. Her marriages were fraught with controversy, and her inability to produce a male heir ensured that the question of succession remained unresolved throughout much of her reign. The monarchy's legitimacy, already in question due to Ferdinand's failure to produce a legitimate heir, was further eroded by Isabella's own personal and dynastic failures. In the end, Isabella's reign would come to an abrupt end in 1870, when she was forced to abdicate after years of political unrest, leaving the throne in a state of limbo. The monarchy, which Ferdinand had fought so hard to preserve, was now seen as a failed institution, and Spain's future seemed uncertain. In the years that followed, Spain would be torn between monarchists and republicans, with the Carlists continuing to vie for power in the ongoing Carlist Wars. Despite several attempts at restoration, the monarchy's grip on power became increasingly tenuous. In 1931, Spain officially became a republic, ending centuries of royal rule. The fall of the Spanish monarchy marked the end of an era, and the monarchy's legacy was forever tarnished by the failures of Ferdinand II. Ferdinand's personal flaws and obsessions had led to the monarchy's downfall. His inability to produce a legitimate male heir, his cruelty toward his wives, and his refusal to accept the reality of his condition had left Spain in a state of political disarray. The consequences of his reign were felt long after his death, as the Spanish monarchy struggled to find its footing in a rapidly changing world. Ferdinand's legacy is a tragic one, marked by personal and political failures. He was a man who, despite wielding immense power, was ultimately undone by his own insecurities and obsessions. His reign, filled with cruelty, paranoia, and dynastic failure, left Spain a fractured nation. The once proud Spanish Empire was reduced to a shadow of its former self, and the monarchy, which had been the symbol of the nation's power, became a symbol of its decline. Ferdinand's failure to secure the throne through his bloodline, combined with his increasingly erratic behavior and the internal conflicts he ignited, created a legacy of chaos and instability that would haunt Spain for generations. The final reckoning for Ferdinand II came not through a military defeat or an external threat, but through the slow collapse of the monarchy he had worked so hard to preserve. Spain, torn apart by war and revolution, would eventually turn its back on the monarchy, seeking a new form of government that could better address the needs of the people. The monarchy that had once ruled the vast territories of the Spanish Empire was now nothing more than a distant memory, and Ferdinand II, the man who had once embodied its power, was reduced to a cautionary tale of personal and political failure. Ferdinand's story is one of lost opportunity and unfulfilled potential. He could have been remembered as a king who led Spain into a new era of prosperity and stability. Instead, he is remembered as a man consumed by his own insecurities, a king whose personal failures led to the destruction of his empire. His legacy serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, of how the private struggles of one individual can ripple through history and shape the fate of a nation. The Spanish monarchy, after Ferdinand's death, would never fully recover. The royal family that had once ruled over a global empire was now a symbol of national decline, and Spain's future would be shaped by the forces of revolution, republicanism, and political upheaval. Ferdinand II's reign, marked by personal and dynastic failure, left an indelible mark on the history of Spain, one that would be felt long after the monarchy was abolished.